Hello, dear students. It's a delight to be back in front of you once more on the Merit Shine channel, and this is Ravi in front of you. Now, today's session is very interesting and has multiple value additions that you can look at. So, of course, it basically is focused on the mains exam towards SBI PO and IBPS PO, right, as expected, and is also focused on one particular segment, which is your general awareness, banking awareness, financial awareness, or whatever else you may want to call it. The other thing which it also discusses is it allows you to basically look at it purely as a mock test, right? So you can obviously look at 40 questions, look at how to attempt those questions as a mock test, and look at the answers as well. But what I've done additionally is that I've not looked at it purely as 40 questions, but I've not just looked at it as a mock itself, right? So while obviously it is a mock, it has 40 questions, and obviously you can time yourself and try to answer all of those questions in a time-bound manner. But I've not just looked at just answering the questions at the end of it, right? So if you look at the analysis, it basically dives a lot deeper in terms of how you would want to approach your reading, how you would want to think about preparing itself, right? So you can use mocks as a very useful way of enhancing your knowledge further, right? One, of course, mocks allow you to be in the exam environment, right? Second, it allows you to basically look at options and apply your common sense to basically arrive at the answer. Many times there could be a possibility to look at elimination as a way to come up at the answer. And last but not the least, mocks basically give you one particular news item, especially I'm talking in the context of awareness. So when you talk about general banking, financial awareness, it basically gives you a question on one particular news item. So the general trend that we've seen is that a news item, just a single question from that news item may not suffice. You need to obviously read the entire news item put together. But questions can be a good way to develop that curiosity to know more about that news, right? Which is what I've tried to do in this set of 40 questions that are there. So these 40 questions, if you look at it from the session perspective, these are not just 40 questions. These are definitely more than 150 questions in themselves, राइट बिकॉज अगर आप सेशन को ध्यान से देखेंगे तो आपको समझेगा कि हर एक क्वेश्चन में ऑप्शंस बहुत ही सोच समझ के डाले गए हैं. And these options will help you unearth many questions, right? So इसमें क्या हो जाएगा कि one, we are not just covering that news item. In some cases, we will cover the news item in depth, and I'll provide you more granular information about that news item थोड़ा in depth में, ताकि आप उस न्यूज़ को अच्छे से समझ सकें and उस न्यूज़ से related other questions क्या possible हैं वो भी आप समझ सकें. And the second perspective here is that those MCQs, right? So these are multiple choices. So those other options that are there, technically what can be the good options pertaining to that question, and how can those options be used to derive other questions, right? So I will give you information pertaining to those options as well, जिससे क्या होगा कि आपको और भी ज़्यादा additional information मिलेगा. So those of you who are looking this as a pure mock test can definitely attempt it in that way. But those of you who want to really understand how to use mock tests in a more effective manner, wherein your learning can be better and it can be more enhanced, then you can obviously watch the entire session itself, wherein a much deeper analysis has been done, and I've literally gone deep dive in terms of giving you a lot of information, which is why I'm again and again reiterating, it's not just 40 questions, it is much more than that, right? So without further ado, let's jump right in and start the session. Right, so what are the instructions? Very simple, 40 questions, 40 marks that are there. For those of you who are really keen to take this as a mock test, so there are 40 questions, 40 marks allotted, 1/4 negative marking for every incorrect answer. And of course, the time allowed is 35 minutes. The objective for you is to maximize your score in that given time. Of course, as I always say, keep a track of the actual time that is being spent. So the way we're going to look at it is that you'll be having one question appearing on your screen. There are two ways you can approach that. Either you collect all the questions and then try to solve them together, or you basically solve one question at a time. It's entirely your call. But the more ideal approach would be to collect all the questions without reading them and try to solve them together, because then it gives you that test environment and you'll be able to track your time and usage of time as well. The important thing to understand here is that every single minute actually counts, because every single minute spent on a question which you do not know the answer to can actually let you miss a question which was actually a sitter and it was later in the exam. So ensure करिए कि आप कोई भी टाइम किसी क्वेश्चन पे फालतू वेस्ट ना करें, बिकॉज अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट उसका काफ़ी ज़्यादा है. आगे चल के वो क्वेश्चन आपको भारी पड़ सकता है, बिकॉज आपने उस पर टाइम स्पेंड किया, उस क्वेश्चन में टाइम स्पेंड करने के चक्कर में कोई आसान क्वेश्चन छूटना नहीं चाहिए. दैट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. सो एंश्योर दैट यू हैव अ क्विक रन थ्रू. सो वंस यू डन दैट फर्स्ट आइटरेशन, देन यू मे बेसिकली यूज योर एलिमिनेशन skills or your common sense to try answering questions which you could not attempt in the first go itself, right? So keep that in mind before you approach this particular mock. And of course, If you're someone who wants to undergo a detailed analysis of it, then you have to stay back in the session. Then you can continue watching the session after the questions have been posted so that you can look at the entire deep dive that have been done in this particular session. So I'll move myself out of the screen and we will quickly get into the test. So here we go. This is question number 1. Second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, 32nd, 33rd, 34th, 35th, 36th, 37th, 38th, 39th, and the last one, the 40th. Right, so let's try and get into the analysis of this, right? So the first thing that I'm essentially looking at is that on your 1st of August 2021, India, basically the non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, basically took over the UNSC presidency. So basically in that context, which are the correct answers or the options that are correct, right? That is what we need to figure out. So first thing is that this is India's 8th term, which definitely is true. India is currently a non-permanent member of the UNSC. That's also true. Under the Asia Pacific category, yes, for a period of 2 years, yes, and from the period 2021 till 2022. So this is basically a no-brainer. If you have actually followed news for quite some time, you'll know that this is what the status is. And the current presidency that happened for India in August 2021 is basically the first time it basically had the presidency coming to it as a non-permanent member during its 8 terms that have been there so far. Now the tricky question here is that was the presidency taken over from United Kingdom or was it from someone else? So that is where the trick comes in. So I'm fairly comfortable with the options 1 and 2 being correct, and from the options I can figure out that this is a combination that works for us perfectly. So can be derived from common sense as well, but if you're someone who's followed the news, you would know this very well. So moving on to trying and deciphering more about this news item, India basically joined the United Nations Security Council in Jan 2021 for its 8th term. And this was for a 2-year term again. So basically looking at it from Jan 2021 till end of 2022, right? And it is one of the 10 rotating non-permanent members of the UNSC, right? So 15 members totally हैं, 15 में से आपके 10 हैं जो कि non-permanent members हैं जो कि rotate होते हैं, right? That is the context. So India's permanent representative to the United Nations is Mr. T.S. Tirumurthy, and he was appointed in April 2020. This is additional bit of trivia for you guys. Again, which are the permanent voting members that we're aware of who have the power of veto? So obviously you have United States, you have United Kingdom, you have France, you have Russia and China. Now technically the other 4 never really had any major issues with India becoming a permanent member in the Security Council of the United Nations, but of course there there have been reservations that have been shown by China in the past, obviously because of neighboring relationships as well. So from that perspective, there is no permanent seat for India as such, but definitely India has taken over the presidency for the period of August 2021, and within this 2-year non-permanent membership of the 8th term that it basically has, right? Now, where did the presidency come to India from, right? So the presidency basically came to India from France, which was basically having the presidency prior to India, and there were a lot of dialogues that were happening between India and France in terms of proper transitioning and other things as well. So from that perspective, the transitioning has happened, and India basically took over from France at that point in time, right? And if you look at the overall context here, the role as a president of the United Nations Security Council is something that was basically going to be passed on to all the 15 members, and they get it in rotation. So one, obviously it preserves the integrity of the post because everyone gets it, everyone values it, everyone understands the roles and responsibilities that come with it, and at the same time it also ensures that there is some consolation prize for even the rotating non-permanent members as well, right? So that is the context here. So essentially, India has taken over the presidency from France, and this was India's 8th term, and India became the president for the United Nations Security Council for August 2021. That's the information. Right, so let's move on to the next one, wherein we look at the question pertaining to which is the incorrect option with regards to the 44th session of the World Heritage Committee, right? So in this question, the options given here are that it was held at Fuzhou, China, which is definitely true. There were 34 properties, 29 in the cultural and the 5 in the natural sites, which basically were inscribed into the UNESCO heritage list that is there. So the current session's inscriptions basically bring the total number of sites under UNESCO's World Heritage list to around 1154 overall. So what happened from an Indian context? From an Indian context, you had Kakatiya Rudreshwara or the Ramappa temple, which is based out of Telangana, and Dholavira, which is a Harappan city in Gujarat. They were added to the World Heritage list as well. So what is incorrect here is the fact that the 45th session of the World Heritage Committee has been scheduled to take place in Baku, Republic of Azerbaijan, from 19th to 30th of June 2022. So the problem here is that the dates are correct, but I know for a fact that it was not 2022 but 2019 when it happened at Baku. So the location for 2022 is in Russia, and that's where this option becomes incorrect. So let's try and understand this a bit more. So 45th session of the World Heritage Committee has been scheduled to take place in Kazan, the Russian Federation, and that is from 19th of June to 30th of June, and that is in 2022. Now coming to where it happened as far as the 43rd session was concerned, the 43rd session of the World Heritage Committee, that happened in Baku, which is the Republic of Azerbaijan, in 2019. Now moving further, your Rudreshwara temple, which is basically known as the Ramappa temple as well, is basically in the village of Palampet, which is approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Hyderabad, and it is basically in the state of Telangana. So this is again an addition to this list of heritage sites as far as the World Heritage Committee is concerned. And then talking about the ancient city of Dholavira, which is the southern center of the Harappan civilization, which is obviously a very revered civilization from an Indian context, right, and is basically sited on the arid island of Khadir in the state of Gujarat. So ये जो दो हैं इस साल के लिस्ट में ऐड किए गए हैं, धोलावीरा एंड रामप्पा टेम्पल या फिर काकतीय रुद्रेश्वरा टेम्पल, राइट. नाउ इसके इंक्लूजन के बाद, राइट, विद दिस इंक्लूजन द नंबर ऑफ वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज साइट्स इन इंडिया बेसिकली स्टैंड्स एट 40 at this point in time, right. When you talk about the natural heritage sites, obviously from a nature perspective these sites become important. So उसके हिसाब से आपके पास हैं Great Himalayan National Park Conservation Area. This was added in 2014. Then you have your Kaziranga National Park, which was added in 1985. Sundarbans National Park, which was added in 1987. Then you have your Kaladeo National Park. It was in 1985 again. Manas Wildlife Sanctuary again 1985, and Nanda Devi and the Valley of Flowers National Parks, that was basically in 1988 and 2005, and then the Western Ghats, which were added in 2012. So these are some of the natural heritage sites. Obviously there are a number of cultural heritage sites as well. Natural is relevant to that because environment ke perspective mein these become a little important, which is why I felt that it's good to basically highlight some of the natural sites that have been included in the World Heritage list. Right, so इस साल के एडिशंस रुद्रेश्वरा टेम्पल एंड काकतीय रुद्रेश्वरा टेम्पल एंड योर धोलावीरा, which is the Harappan civilization. So ये दोनों ऐड हुए हैं, and 45th session जो है that has been scheduled for Kazan, which is in the Russian Federation in the month of June 2022. Right, let's move on to the next question. अब इसमें क्या है? who was selected for the Lokmanya Tilak National Award? Okay, so this is the question that is there, and it was Dr. Cyrus Poonawalla. It's a no-brainer in the context that obviously he did a lot of good work in terms of providing the vaccines for the COVID situation, and hence he was provided with this award. Now let's understand a bit more context from this perspective. So obviously Mr. Cyrus Poonawalla, who's a very well-known famous businessman, and is obviously the founder chairperson of the Pune-based Serum Institute of India SII, which basically came up with Covishield, and obviously he was named as the recipient of the prestigious Lokmanya Tilak National Award for the year 2021. Now, the award basically was instituted by the Kesari Maratha Trust, and it was first given in 1983. एंड पिछले years में काफ़ी सारे प्राइम मिनिस्टर्स हैं जिनको ये अवार्ड मिला गया है. सो यू टॉक अबाउट श्रीमती इंदिरा गांधी, यू टॉक अबाउट अटल बिहारी वाजपेयी, डॉक्टर मनमोहन सिंह. मेनी ऑफ देम हैव रिसीव्ड दिस अवार्ड इन द पास्ट, राइट? एंड फॉर्मर प्रेसिडेंट प्रणब मुखर्जी एंड इवन reputed businessmen and founders like your Infosys president Narayan Murthy, they have also been recipients of this award in the past. So ये काफ़ी prestigious award है in that sense, and definitely Cyrus Poonawalla basically enters a very select list of individuals who have basically achieved this award. Now talking about the other options, now Sanjay Gupta जो हैं, he is basically the editor-in-chief of Jagran, and he was honored with this award for his contribution to the field of journalism, and that was in the year 2019, right? So 2019 में संजय गुप्ता जी को मिला था, अभी 2021 में डॉक्टर साइरस पूनावाला को मिल रहा है. Then if you look at the other option, Dr. Krishna Ella, again a very well-known person, especially in that fight against COVID, because Serum Institute of India के बाद दूसरा कौन सा था, which was the other vaccine that was there, Covaxin, right? किसने डेवलप किया? भारत बायोटेक. और भारत बायोटेक के जो फाउंडर और चेयरमैन मैनेजिंग डायरेक्टर कौन है? That is this person. So he is an entrepreneur and an Indian scientist. So Dr. Krishna Ella was basically having a lot of news items coming to him as well. So with regards to some controversies in terms of the vaccine approvals being delayed by the IMF overall as well, right? So उस चीज़ों से related भी वो news में थे. Unfortunately उनको ये award नहीं मिला, but he's again a well-known gentleman from the Indian context. So next we move on to G. Satish Reddy or Dr. Satish Reddy. He's basically the secretary of the Department of Defense in terms of research and development, and he's the chairman of India's DRDO, which is the Defense Research and Development Organization, right? This is basically India's indigenous development of the defense equipments and systems, right, and technologies. So again, why this becomes relevant is because he was recently conferred with the Aryabhatta Award by the Astronautical Society of India, or ASI as it is called, and this gentleman again has done great work for us in the astronautical field overall. So that is Dr. G. Satish Reddy, right? So that's the answer in that context. So now quickly moving on to the next question, right? So India's first indigenous aircraft carrier, so we're talking about IAC-1, right? Dash has been launched for sea trials off the coast of Kochi, Kerala. So काफ़ी सारे options हैं which look pretty similar. So the context is that if we delve a little deeper, basically the keel or the basic structure of the 40,000 ton warship was laid way back in 2009, this particular warship, which is the answer to this question, and this was built by the CSL or the Cochin Shipyard Limited. So that's the entity which actually built this, and the answer in this case of course is INS Vikrant, right? And if we delve a little deeper, the estimated cost of this project was roughly around 23,000 crore that was there. And then if I talk about IAC-1 itself, so it basically is an indigenous aircraft carrier, which means that जो aircraft carrier है वो इंडिया में ही बनाया गया. That is why it's called indigenous, right? So it is basically going to operate your MiG-29K fighter aircraft, then your Kamov 31 air early warning helicopters, then your soon to be inducted MH-60R multi-role helicopters, and the indigenously manufactured advanced light helicopters. इन सब के लिए ये बनाया गया है. So this is basically going to be an aircraft carrier, right? That's the context. Now this is to be commissioned by August 2022, that's the expectation, and this indigenous aircraft carrier will be named Vikrant, and it will be India's second aircraft carrier in the service after INS Vikramaditya. Now indigenous aircraft carrier 1 इसलिए है because ये पहली बार indigenously बनाया गया है. इससे पहले जो aircraft carrier हमारे पास था, that was INS Vikramaditya, which was already there, right? And this is basically a Russian origin vessel when we talk about INS Vikramaditya. So talking about INS Virat, it is basically a Centaur class aircraft carrier of the Indian Navy, and INS Virat was the flagship of the Indian Navy before INS Vikramaditya was basically brought in, right? उससे पहले आपका INS Virat चलता था, right? And INS Vikramaditya was actually commissioned in 2013. उसके पहले तक you had INS Virat, and this ship was basically completed and commissioned way back in 1959, right? As the Royal Navy's HMS Hermes, and it was decommissioned in the year 1984, and it was sold to India in 1987. So that's a brief bit about INS Virat. Talking about INS Vishal, ये है फ्यूचर की तरफ देखते हैं तब की बात करते हैं, बिकॉज दिस इज IAC-2 विच इज इंडिजीनियस एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर 2. So this is basically a planned aircraft carrier to be built by again Cochin Shipyard Limited only for the Indian Navy, right? And it is going to be intended as the second aircraft to be built in India after INS Vikrant. So IAC-1 was INS Vikrant, and IAC-2 is expected to be INS Vishal. So now talking about INS Arihant, this is basically designated an S2 strategic strike nuclear submarine, right? And it is basically the lead ship of India's Arihant class of let's say nuclear powered ballistic missile submarines that are there, right? So in that context, INS Arihant comes into the picture. काफी भारी है, 6,000 ton vessel, and this was built under the Advanced Technology Vessel Project, basically at the shipbuilding center in the port of Visakhapatnam. So that is where this was built. So these are some of the things that I wanted to share, not just talk about the answer which is INS Vikrant. So future के perspective से INS Vishal, अगर पीछे जाएं तो then it becomes what do you say, INS Vikramaditya, and उससे भी पीछे जाएं तो it becomes INS Virat, and then अगर submarines की बात करें तो it becomes INS Arihant, right? Let's move on to the next question now. Recently, the state of Dash has launched the first earthquake early warning mobile app for alerting its people about the onset of earthquakes, and it's been developed by Dash. So obviously जो region है और उसके अंदर जो IIT है, that is fairly straightforward, so वहाँ से आप eliminate नहीं कर पाओगे. But if you look at it from an earthquake prone areas perspective also, आप थोड़ा बहुत narrow down कर सकते हो from a elimination standpoint. So the answer in this case is this was developed by IIT Roorkee. Either you know उत्तराखंड ने डेवलप करवाया है ये ऐप विच इज EEW, और इफ यू नो दैट IIT रूरकी ने डेवलप कराया, वहां से आपका आंसर आराम से हो सकता है. अगर दोनों ही नहीं पता तो ऑब्वियसली यू नीड टू थिंक अ बिट एज वेल. So talking about that, so Uttarakhand Chief Minister Pushkar Singh Dhami basically launched this path-breaking application which is called as your Uttarakhand Bhukamp Alert, right? So that is what it is basically called, and that has been developed by IIT Roorkee. Now talking about it, I want to also highlight some of the important developments or discoveries or inventions done by the other IITs as well that can possibly be of relevance here. So talking about IIT Bombay, they basically came up with a converter which was looking at converting your nitrogen generators into oxygen generators in order to obviously address the shortage of oxygen that we were facing during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this was under Professor Milind Atre. Now talking about the next development, we have IIT Kharagpur which came up with an AI-based system to basically process your Sanskrit texts, right? And this was under Dr. Pawan Goyal, right? And the idea was that how do you make Sanskrit more accessible to the people, right? That was the whole idea. Then they also came up with another flagship healthcare product which is basically called as your COVID-RAP, in the process of rapidly diagnosing COVID, right? So that was the whole idea, and that was under Professor Suman Chakraborty and Dr. Arindam Mondal. So that is basically at IIT Kharagpur. Then IIT Madras also came up with some important aspects with regards to blockchain, wherein they came up with a blockchain-based healthcare information system for your mobile application. So that's what IIT Madras did, and this basically application was called as your BlockTrack. And the idea was to digitize all your medical information, right? So a lot of this information is carried in the form of prescriptions, which is in paper format. So all of that basically changed. And this is also trying to protect your sensitive personal information and your medical records as well, right? So the CSR support for this was given by Infosys, and this was under Professor Prabhu Rajagopal. So that is what IIT Madras did. Talking about IIT Kanpur basically created the Swasa Oxyrize bottle, which is basically a device that can be carried anywhere with the intention of meeting any emergency oxygen requirements that you may have, right? And this was developed at the IIT Kanpur Incubation Center. Basically, eSpin, Nanotech, and Jasolab also had a role to play in this as well, right? So moving on to the last element, which is IIT Mandi, basically developed something called as the Lakshman Rekha, which kind of uses geotagging and an AI-driven home quarantine system to ensure that the people who've been affected by COVID stay back in their homes only. So that was the context as far as this particular question was concerned. So the answer was fairly straightforward. Uttarakhand IIT Roorkee came up with the earthquake early warning, or also known as your Uttarakhand Bhukamp alert. But the other IITs also were not sitting idle. They also developed a lot of things, right? And definitely added a lot of value, especially in these difficult times of COVID, right? So that is this question. Next, moving on to the next question, I'm talking about which state basically launched the eNagar mobile application and the portal covering 10 modules offering 52 services, right? So generally, if I were to take an educated guess, whenever I'm naming something eNagar, the context could be that the answer could possibly be Gujarat as well, because it fits into that context overall. But if you look at the options also, when I talk about portal covering 10 modules and 52 services, eNagar is a mobile application which was basically launched by the Gujarat Chief Minister Vijay Rupani, and the context is that it has 10 modules and 52 services, and the focus is on several things like your property tax, you talk about your professional tax, water tax, then you talk about your complaint grievance redressals, then your building permissions, fire and emergency services. A lot of these things get addressed there as well. So in this context, who's the nodal agency here? So the nodal agency in this case is your Gujarat Urban Development Mission that has been appointed as the nodal agency. So it is basically going to look at covering around 170 locations, basically 162 municipalities and 8 municipal corporations as well, right? And I want to talk about some of the other apps that are there as well. So the Union Minister of State for Education, Dr. Subhash Sarkar, announced the launch of the Bhasha Sangam, which is basically a mobile app that can teach more than 100 plus sentences in 22 different languages, right? And this came out in December 2021, right? So this is Bhasha Sangam, and Minister of State for Education, Dr. Subhash Sarkar, was the one who launched it. Then you also had the Chief Secretary of Karnataka, basically P. Ravi Kumar, who launched the Mara Mitra. So Mara Mitra obviously you know is a friend. Mara in South India is basically known as the tree, right? So it's basically a tree's friend. So this was an initiative started by Kaveri Calling, which is doing a lot of initiatives under the issues with regards to the Kaveri water getting eroded, right? So from that perspective, how do you ensure good afforestation drive along the Kaveri basin? That was the whole idea, and this happened in September 2021. So this was basically your Mara Mitra. Then obviously I just want to discuss about a couple of other apps which have come in the past, but maybe something that you may want to recollect or remember, which is Umang, one of them, basically unified mobile application for your new age governance, right? So it's basically related to providing access to a lot of your governance related aspects from an e-governance standpoint, right? So how do you automate a lot of things? That was the whole idea with Umang. And the idea was, how could you provide access to different government services under one umbrella, right? So the ministry is responsible for obviously is METI, which is the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, along with NEGD, which is your National E-Governance Division as well. The other app which I want to talk about was ePathshala, which is again a mobile app to achieve equitable, quality, inclusive education and lifelong learning for all, and basically bridging the digital divide that exists in the country. So this is where ePathshala came into the picture, and it allows the user to carry as many books as your device allows you to carry, depending on your memory, right? So that is the context of ePathshala. So something which I want to additionally discuss in terms of the apps that have come through. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but I tried to cover as many as I could. But eNagar was basically launched in Gujarat, right? Moving on to the next one, we basically look at which state government has introduced the Rajiv Gandhi Award for Excellence in Information Technology, named after the former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, to recognize the firms that excel in information technology sector. So this was something which was launched in Maharashtra, and Satej Patil, the Minister of State for IT, Maharashtra, basically announced the MVA, or the Maharashtra Vikas Aghadi, also basically the Maharashtra Development Front. That is what MVA stands for in the English language, but MVA essentially is your Maharashtra Vikas Aghadi, right? And it basically was declaring an award in the name of late Shri Rajiv Gandhi, to encourage organizations to excel in the IT sector as far as Maharashtra is concerned. That was the whole objective, right? So moving on to the next question, we're looking at the 8th one now. So which city has been declared as the first water plus city? So obviously the smart guess here would be that Indore is doing a lot of good work from this perspective. So it is definitely the cleanest city as well. And then it has basically received the tag of the water plus city as well, right? So Indore is India's cleanest city. It has now been declared as India's first water plus city, right, under the Swachh Sarvekshan 2021, which is the 6th edition. So the first edition of Swachh Sarvekshan happened in 2016 as part of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan itself, right? So talking about this, the Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan actually tweeted about it, congratulating the city for the fabulous achievement that it basically was able to do. And then after Indore, now Hyderabad also has become a water plus city. It has become the first city in Telangana which has become water plus, or rather got the water plus certificate. Now the question is कि water plus होता क्या है? So इसका मतलब ये है कि before you basically let the water go into the environment, you're basically treating it well enough. ट्रीटिंग इट वेल इनफ मतलब वेस्ट वाटर जो भी है आपका, उसको आप अच्छे से ट्रीट करके उसमें जो इम्प्योरिटीज हैं, कंटामिनेशन हैं, उसको हटा के आप उसको एनवायरमेंट में वापस रिलीज कर रहे हो, राइट? दैट इज द होल कॉन्टेक्स्ट. दैट इज व्हाई इट्स कॉल्ड वाटर प्लस, व्हिच मींस द ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ योर sewage water is so good that it is being released to an environment at an acceptable level. That is what water plus means. And especially in the context of your global warming, climate change, this definitely becomes a very, very important thing to address, right? So talking about the other winners in this Swachh Sarvekshan, you basically look at Vita as one of the cities which won the category of the under 1 lakh population. So if you look at the top 3 ranks, Vita, Lonavala and Saswat, all these are cities from Maharashtra who basically won the award in the under 1 lakh population category. Now moving further, if you look at the greater than 1 lakh population category, then for the 5th consecutive year, it was Indore which won the India's Cleanest City Award. And then you had Surat, which was at 2nd position, and Vijayawada was at the 3rd position overall, right? Now talking about any state with more than 100 urban local bodies, in that category Chhattisgarh won the award for the cleanest state, and this is the 3rd consecutive year in which Chhattisgarh has won this award. And which was the state which was the most fast moving? That was Karnataka, right? So Karnataka basically won the award for the fastest mover state in this particular category, right? So there are 2 things that I've discussed here. One is the water plus city, which started off with Indore, and now Hyderabad also there, and a couple of other players also, but first was Indore. And as far as the cleanest cities and states are concerned, we've talked about that as well in this, right? Moving on to the 9th question. Who is the author of the book titled How the Earth Got Its Beauty? So again, another gem written by Sudha Murthy, right? And she's basically got it published by Penguin House, and it has illustrations by Priyanka Panchpande. And the idea of publishing this book was to basically ensure that the children in this age group of, let's say, 5 to 10 years can actually read a book which talks about the beauty of the earth through illustrations, right? And that was the whole idea behind this book that came out, right? And I have to talk about the other authors as well, because I'm a huge fan of English novels, and essentially all of these are highly reputed authors. So first of all, we'll start off with Jhumpa Lahiri. So again, the context here is that she's also come out with the latest book in this year, which is Whereabouts in 2021. Again, very famous for a fantastic book that she's written in the past, which is The Interpreter of Maladies, which obviously won the Pulitzer Prize for that particular year in 2000, of course. And then Namesake, of course, has been made as a movie also, right? You had Unaccustomed Earth that came out in 2008, and The Lowland in 2013. And this year, she's come out with Whereabouts. Next thing is basically Salman Rushdie, another very reputed author. Again, he came up with Languages of Truth this year. This was in 2021. His past masterpieces obviously include Midnight's Children, a fantastic book. This came way back in 1981. Then Satanic Verses in 1988. Obviously, it was a highly controversial book, and issues regarding fatwa and other things also happened at that point of time. Then he's written The Moor's Last Sigh, then The Ground Beneath Her Feet, again a very good book, and The Enchantress of Florence is again a good read. So some of the good books that Salman Rushdie has written. Again, Languages of Truth is the one that came out in 2021. Then talking about Amitav Ghosh, again his guy who's brought India a lot of laurels. Again, Jungle Nama is the book that he's come out with in 2021. The Glass Palace came in 2000. Hungry Tide, again a fantastic book, and again a great book in Sea of Poppies. And all of this basically kind of built his reputation as a great author, and he's obviously got a Padma Shri as well. So next, talking about Chitra Banerjee Devakurni, she's basically written a latest book which is called as The Last Queen in the year 2021, and her obviously good works include Mistress of Spices that came out in 1997, and then obviously famous for Palace of Illusions, which came out in 2008, which talks about the Mahabharata from the eyes of Draupadi. So that is some good authors in this slide for you guys, and some of the good works that they've come out in the year 2021, right? Moving on to the next question. We basically are looking at Dr. Bibek Debroy, the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, released the Quality of Life for the Elderly Index, right? So now talking about the elements of this index, this was obviously created by the Institute for Competitiveness, IFC, at the request of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister. And the index basically did not analyze 35 different indicators. Obviously, there were some key indicators that they did analyze, and across 4 key domains. One definitely was your social well-being, one was your health systems, and one was your income security, but it was not about functional well-being. So while functional well-being is important, the parameter that here was analyzed from a, elderly index, or quality of life for an elderly index, was from the perspective of the financial well-being and not functional well-being. So that is where this option goes wrong. Right, so financial well-being obviously becomes an important parameter to consider. Now, which are the sub pillars that were there? Obviously, economic empowerment, education attainment and employment. Social status becomes very important. Then you look at physical security, and then the basic health of elders again becomes very important. Then you talk about the psychological well-being, which is very crucial, and then social security again being a very important angle, and last but not least, enabling the environment. So these are some of the 8 sub pillars that were considered. Right. So if you look at the overall rankings, Rajasthan basically topped the list in terms of the aged states, and Himachal Pradesh basically topped the list in terms of the relatively aged states, right? In terms of union territories, it was Chandigarh, and in terms of the northeastern states, it was Mizoram. So these are the entities that have done well. So now the context is, what is an aged state, right? So aged state is a state where the elderly population is greater than 5 million. Now, when the population is less than 5 million, then basically you say that that particular state is relatively aged, right? So aged state, greater than 5 million population; relatively aged state, less than 5 million population, right? So the index basically analyzed these 4 fundamental parameters, which is your financial well-being, then it talked about your social well-being, then it talked about your health system, and of course, it talked about your income security as well. So these are the 4 parameters and not functional well-being, which is where this particular option goes wrong. Right, moving on to the next question again. Which is the first national park in India to be equipped with satellite phones, and this is basically an initiative that is to basically boost your anti-poaching measures that are there in the park. So obviously the entity which requires this the most probably is Kaziranga, because a lot of those kind of things have happened in the past as well. So from that perspective, this answer kind of fits the bill overall. But before we move into the other options, let's try and understand a bit more about this news item itself. So essentially talking about the Assam Foreign and Environment Minister Parimal Suklabaidya, he basically thanked CM Himanta Biswa Sarma for his prompt initiative in equipping the forest personnel with satellite phones, and the approximate cost is found to be approximately 16 lakhs, and it was done by BSNL. The idea is to ensure that areas where the mobile phones don't work, these satellite phones can basically help in easy communication between the forest personnel and ensure that any kind of poaching activities can be avoided. Now, talking about the other options that are given, so let's start off with this one, which is Jogighopa National Park, again in Assam. So the Union Minister for Road Transport and Highways, Nitin Jairam Gadkari ji, basically has laid the foundation stone for India's first MMLP, which is basically your multimodal logistics park, right, at Jogighopa in Assam, right? It has obviously a combined railroad bridge that is already there, which is basically called as your Naranarayan Setu, and this is over the Brahmaputra river. So Jogighopa will now basically get its MMLP, which is your first multimodal logistics park, right? That is where this came into the news. So the next one, which is relevant from the perspective of your Anamudi Shola National Park, which is in Idukki, Kerala, is because of the fact that a tree fern, and obviously one of its kind of a revelation here, that a tree fern has been selected as the flagship species of that particular national park, right? So this is basically your Cyathea crinite, which has been declared as that tree fern, which is going to be the symbol or the flagship species of that particular national park. And this is the first time a tree fern has been chosen, right? And this will basically be the icon of conservation at your Anamudi Shola National Park, and this will be there for the next 10 years. So that is where Anamudi basically came into the news. Then you have your Balpakram National Park, which is situated in the south of Garo Hills in Meghalaya, and it is home to one of the rarest animals in the world, which is the lesser panda or the red panda as well. So there have been a lot of talks and let's say recommendations from the Indian standpoint to basically add Balpakram National Park as part of the World Heritage Sites. But we obviously know the result for this year in terms of Ramappa Temple and Dhoravira, but this probably could be an addition in the coming years as well. Right. So last but not the least, we talk about the Gugamal National Park, which is basically based out of Amravati. It is one of the 7 protected areas in the Melghat Tiger Reserve, and that is where it becomes into relevance and was in the news primarily for that perspective in the last year or so. Right, so that is in terms of some of the national parks and them being in the news. So satellite phones, Kaziranga National Park in Assam. Right, moving on to the next question, we talk about Nitin Chugh has basically resigned as the MD and CEO of which company. So this was in news for quite some time. This is basically USFB, which is your Ujjivan Small Finance Bank. Right, so let's try and understand who's going to take over. So basically, Ujjivan Small Finance Bank current MD and CEO, objectively subject to various kind of regulatory approvals, is Ithira Davis, again a postgraduate from IIM Ahmedabad and has tremendous amount of experience in the banking industry. Right, so expected to take over from Nitin Chugh. Talking about the other entities, Bandhan Bank, the founder, MD and CEO is Chandrasekhar Ghosh. He's still pretty much there. Then you talk about Equitas Small Finance Bank, MD and CEO is Vasudevan Pathangi Narasimhan. Then you have RBL Bank, the current MD and CEO is Vishwaveer Ahuja. So next up, talking about Unity Small Finance Bank, the latest one to enter into the fray, basically as a combination of BharatPe and Centrum and taking over from PMC. So from that perspective, the interim CEO is expected to be Indrajit Kamotra, who also happens to be the executive director at Centrum Financial Services. So basically some bit of news from a small finance bank and normal bank's perspective. Right, next, moving on to the next news. Basically this is with regards to the appointment of a prime minister, and the question is, Ismail Sabri Yaqub has been appointed as the prime minister of which country? So the answer in this case happens to be Malaysia. So Dato Sri Ismail Sabri bin Yaqub is a Malaysian politician who served as the 9th prime minister of Malaysia, and he's there since 2021 August. Right, so talking about the next option, which is basically the prime minister of Djibouti since 2013, that's been Abdul Qadir Kamil Mohammed, and he's been the PM since 2013. Talking about the next one, which is the current prime minister of Egypt in 2018, that is basically Mustafa Kemal Madbouly, and president is basically Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and he was the one who basically brought in Mustafa Kemal as well. Then talking about the next, the Prime Minister of Brunei is basically also the head of government of Brunei, and concurrently the title is also held by the Sultan of Brunei, right? And who's this person at this point of time who's the head of state? That is basically Hassan al-Bolkiah, who's the head of state, and he's been there for quite some time, over 3 decades now. So next up, talking about Philippines, the president has been Rodrigo Duterte, who's been there since 2016 June. So those are some of the heads of states in the various countries that are given in the options as well. Right, moving on to the next question, we're talking about 14th. So the government of India has launched a new geospatial planning portal under Bhuvan, which is to enable the MGNREGA assets planning by using remote sensing and GIS, which is the Geographical Information System, right? So what is this planning portal called? It's basically called as Yuktdhara. As far as the other options are concerned in this case, it does not really necessarily mean anything overall. These are just Sanskrit words. So the Minister of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj, Giriraj Singh, basically launched the new geospatial planning portal called as Yuktdhara, wherein your Union Minister Jitendra Singh said that it will help in facilitating your MGNREGA assets using remote sensing and GIS information based data as well, right? That's the context as far as this particular answer is concerned. Now talking about Bhuvan as well. So this is basically ISRO's geo portal, and it obviously provides a rich information base overall. Providing satellite images and analytical capabilities also is something that Bhuvan comes up with, and this is basically now Bhuvan has become the de facto geospatial platform for various kinds of initiatives that have been taken from this perspective, right? So technically your Yuktdhara is also under Bhuvan only, right? So talking about Kshitatalam and Pamshut basically refers to words that are referring to the earth, and then talking about Shramik, which is basically someone who's a worker. So just that this word was related to Sanskrit, we thought let's try and bring in some Sanskrit options for you guys, right? That's the idea. So moving on to the next one. Right, so basically you're talking about the UP Expressway Industrial Development Authority, UPEIDA, which basically received the sanction letter of a securitization based loan, which was worth rupees 5,100 crore from which particular bank? That's the question for this 594-kilometer long Ganga Expressway project, right? So obvious curiosity comes in as to kisne ye loan diya tha. So obviously the answer in this case, of course, is Punjab National Bank, right? So talking about the Ganga Expressway, it will be the longest in North India and the second longest in the country overall. And the project's estimated cost is roughly around 36,230 crores that is there. Now, obviously, this was basically handed over, or the sanction letter was handed over by SS Mallikarjuna Rao, who's the MD and CEO of Punjab National Bank at this point in time, right? Which is going to be the longest. It's going to be DME, which is the Delhi-Mumbai Expressway that's going to be there. It's going to be 1380 kilometers long, and it is being constructed for rupees 98,000 crores. And the expressway will basically pass through 6 states, which are the ones Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat and Maharashtra, of course. So these will be the 6 states from where it will pass through. Foundation stone for DME was laid on 9th of March 2019. And out of the 1380 kilometers that are there, contracts for more than 1200 kilometers have already been awarded and they are under progress, right? So that is basically your DME or Delhi Mumbai Expressway. Talking about the other long expressways that are there, so you have Agra Lucknow Expressway at 301 kilometers. Then you have your Yamuna Expressway at 165 kilometers. Then you're talking about the Hyderabad ORR, which basically is at 158 kilometers again. So when I talk about securitization, what exactly is happening? There's a third entity which comes into the picture. So एक borrower आपका already है, right? And then you have a third entity which is coming in, which is basically known as your issuer, right? So इसमें अभी context क्या है कि these are the ones, or the issuers are the ones who will be selling the securities to your investors. अब investors पैसा दे रहे हैं, right? किसको दे रहे हैं? They're giving it to the borrowers, and borrowers are expected to make those frequent interest payments. Those things will keep happening, right? And what will happen essentially is the borrowers have basically mortgaged that particular asset. Basically, that's how you get that loan itself, right? So essentially the investors are buying those bonds, right? And that bond के लिए जो पैसा दे रहे हैं, that is going to be used for funding the project, so to speak, right? And asset जो है, that will be mortgaged. So that's the whole context as far as your securitization is concerned. Obviously, this was again misused during the global financial crisis, and if you remember the scenario about mortgage-backed securities and your credit default swaps, all of these were basically a result of securitization only. But of course, it has a lot of positive benefits as well. But थोड़े negative issues भी हो सकते हैं अगर instrument समझ में ना आए तो, right? So this is a securitization based loan that has been given by Punjab National Bank to the UPEIDA, which is the UP Expressway Industrial Development Authority, right? Moving on to the next question now, 16th. Which Indian SMEs have won the United Nations Food Systems Summit competition, which is the Best Small Business Good Food for All? Right, so the answer in this case is all of A, B, and C. So ये तीनों ही companies जो हैं, these are like what do you say, small and medium enterprises in India. They won this award. Let's try and understand a bit more about these companies. So basically, when you talk about it, overall 50 SMEs globally have been announced as winners as part of this Best Small Business for Good Food for All competition. This was held in conjunction with the United Nations Food Systems Summit. Now talking about the Special Envoy, Dr. Agnes Kalabata, the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, right? Now talking about Edible Roots Private Limited. So basically the founder is Kapil Mandavewala, and it's one of the largest organic farming organizations that is there from an Indian context. So it basically allows you to set up kitchen gardens, then rents out community farms for the urban growers जो क्या कहते हैं फार्मिंग करना चाहते हैं उनके लिए, right? And conducts workshops on organic farming and sustainability, and basically sells various kinds of farming products. So that's what Kapil Mandavewala is basically providing through your Edible Roots Private Limited. Then you talk about the next one, which is your Urja Development Solutions India. So Amit Saraugi, who's the CEO and co-founder, and he was also shortlisted for the Wastelets Global Citizen Award in the year 2021. And Dr. Clementine Chambon, who she is the Chief Technology Officer and the co-founder for this entity, which is Urja Development. So what it does, Urja, different from others, is just like we know that there is something called as SaaS, which is software as a service. So Urja is trying to provide farming as a service, right? So basically it's a subscription-based model, and the company is working at the intersection between your agriculture as well as your clean energy. That's what Urja is trying to do. Then talking about the next one, which is the Taru Naturals. So the co-founders Ruchi Jain and Poonam Jain have basically combined to create an organic fair trade foods brand, and this basically focuses on sourcing and creating a market for your organically grown superfoods such as your black rice and turmeric, etc., from around 10,000 identified tribal and your small scale farmers which are networked across India. So that is what your Taru Naturals is also doing. So your Edible Roots Private Limited, your Taru Naturals, and your Urja Development Solutions are the three entities which have won in the good food for all category in terms of best small businesses, and represented India and Dana's proud, right? That's the context here. Moving on to the next question, we have the number 17, who along with the American musician Bruce Springsteen authored the book Renegades, born in the USA, which is basically bound around the editions of the Renegades podcast. So if you're someone who's been following podcasts, then you know that Bruce Springsteen, who's a very famous musician, has combined with Barack Obama to create a podcast. And while they were creating that podcast, they had a lot of intimate and in-depth conversations about family, politics, and a lot of other things as well. And all of that has been combined as part of this book itself. Now, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen obviously go a long way back, so it's not as if they were meeting for the first time for this podcast. They've been knowing each other for a long time in the past as well. So this podcast was just a way for them to come together and talk about a lot of intimate things. And this book basically shares a lot of those revelations. So that's what this book does. So that is between Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama. Talking about the Barack Obama context, he's also the number one person in terms of the world's most admired people, which was basically launched by YouGov America, and the top 3 spots have been unchanged in the last 2 years. So essentially, when I talk about the males, you talk about Barack Obama as number 1, Bill Gates at number 2, and the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping at number 3. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is at number 8, and Sachin Tendulkar is at number 12 in this list. Talking about the females, Michelle Obama continues to lead the list, followed by actress and philanthropist Angelina Jolie, and British monarch Queen Elizabeth II is the 3rd person on this list. Priyanka Chopra incidentally happens to be at number 10. Talking about some of the other famous personalities in the options here. So Kamala Devi Harris, she's basically is the 49th and the current Vice President of the United States of America. So she's the first female Vice President and the highest ranking female official in US history. And she also happens to be the first African American and the first Asian American Vice President. So African American because her father was of that origin, and Asian American because her mother was Asian. So that's the context. So a lot of firsts as far as Kamala Devi Harris is concerned. Talking about Mike Pence, or Michael Richard Pence, he was the 48th Vice President of the United States of America from the period 2017 till 2021. So talking about the next one, which is basically Will Smith, and this gentleman is amazing, right? In the context that he's given us fantastic music videos, he's given us amazing performances, both in terms of sitcoms, we talk about the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, or movies like the Ali, Pursuit of Happiness, and Concussion, and a lot of others in that context. The biggest point for this gentleman is that he has still not won a Academy Award in that context, right? And he's delivered some amazing performances, right? We talk about Ali, and when Ali came out, unfortunately, that was the time when Beautiful Mind also came out and Russell Crowe won the Oscar. Then again, you had an Academy nomination for Pursuit of Happiness, but that was the year in which it was taken by your Forrest Whitaker for The Last King of Scotland, again a brilliant movie then as well. And then of course Concussion, you would know that it was nominated in the same year that Revenant, which won the Oscar for Leonardo DiCaprio finally. So that happened. So obviously, right, this guy has been nominated for a lot of awards, but he's still not given up. And this King Richard, the movie that has come, is nominated for the year 2022. Right, so it kind of tells you that despite a lot of, I won't call it a failure, he obviously was nominated for winning the awards, but he never won it, right? So he never won the award, but he's still not given up. He continues on that journey, and that is something we should definitely learn from, and this can add a lot of value as well, right? So that is on Will Smith. And then talking about the last person on this list, which is basically Lina Nair. So she was the global CHRO of Unilever, which is a phenomenal achievement in itself. And obviously to the likes of Indra Nooyi as well, who was heading PepsiCo also. So again, Lina Nair is from an Indian origin, and now she becomes the youngest female CEO of Chanel, right? So that is something which is a phenomenal achievement also. So I mean, both these cases, talk about Will Smith tells you never to give up, and talk about Leena Nair. What a phenomenal achievement, right? Amazing, right? So that is something which you can derive a lot of value from, and that is why I wanted to share this question as a motivational angle as well. Right, moving on to the next one, basically question number 18. So we talk about which of the following regarding the money market instruments is correct. You already know that your call money markets are less than 2 days, so this is incorrect. Notice money between 2 to 14 days, this is incorrect. Term money is greater than 14 days up to 1 year, this is fine. So talking about the categories, or let's say the limits that have been set up. So your scheduled commercial banks, including your small finance banks, basically your call and notice money, it can be up to 100% of the capital funds on a daily average basis on a reporting fortnight, and basically 125% of the total capital funds on any given day. So that's the limit for your call and notice money. When it comes to term money, it basically depends on the internal board approval limit that is there within the prudential limits for your interbank liabilities that could be there between various banks. That is on the overall limits. Talking about payments banks and your regional rural banks, what is the limit for them? In terms of call, notice and term money, all of them basically have a 100% limit in terms of the capital funds on a daily average basis in a reporting fortnight. Reporting fortnight मतलब हर दूसरे fortnight को RBI को they have to report balances, right? So from that perspective, that particular Friday is referred to as the reporting Friday or the reporting fortnight, right? And then you have a 125% of the capital funds on any given day. So that is basically on your payments banks and your regional rural banks. Talking about your cooperative banks, the limit is fairly simple in terms of call, notice and term money. It's just 2% of the aggregate deposits that are there at the end of the previous financial year. Only that is the extent or the limit to which your activities can happen in the money markets for your cooperative banks. Then it comes to your primary dealers. Obviously, they need to have a lot more ability. So that is where in terms of call and notice money, it is 225% of the net owned funds as at the end of the previous financial year on a daily average basis in a reporting fortnight. And then in terms of term money, it basically refers to, let's say, 225% of the net owned funds at the end of the previous financial year overall. So that's the context as far as your primary dealers are concerned. So why did I highlight all of these limits? Because obviously these have come out recently. So as a result, it's important to know some of these limits. It might be relevant from an exam perspective as well, right? So moving on to the next question now. So basically, when I talk about reviewing the market conditions and the government borrowing program, the RBI has basically modified the auction methodology of the benchmark securities of tenor 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, 14-year, and also for your floating rate bonds to dash from dash. So it earlier used to be a multiple price based auction methodology, and then it was changed to a uniform price auction method. That's what has happened overall. Right, so technically, again, Swiss auction that is mentioned here is a kind of auction that is used in your public-private partnerships, right? So that's the context there, but it's not really relevant in this context here, right? So the auction of other benchmark securities such as your 30-year and the 40 years has basically remained unchanged, and they continue as per the multiple price-based auctions. So when you talk about the uniform price auction method, all the successful bidders are basically required to pay for the allotted quantity of the government securities at the same rate, which will be the cutoff rate, right? So जो भी cutoff rate होगा उतना ही उनको भी pay करना है. They don't have to pay the rate at which they had bid, right? That is the whole context of a uniform price-based auction method. And then when I talk about multiple price auction method, obviously successful bidders will obviously be required to pay at the rate at which they had bid itself. That is why it is multiple price. Uniform matlab everyone will be allotted at the cutoff itself, and when it comes to multiple price, जो जितने भी rate के लिए आपने bid किया है उसी rate पे आपका allotment भी होगा. That's the context, right? So overall, it kind of helps in better benchmarking of the short-term duration instruments, and it also adds a lot of value from that standpoint, right? So that is where this particular revision happened from an RBI perspective. Next up, moving on to question number 20, talking about a secured interbank overnight interest rate and reference rate established as an alternative to LIBOR. So obviously MIFOR is not established as an alternative to LIBOR. SOBR is not relevant. It's not a borrowing rate overall. So it is basically talking about sterling internight forward interbank average rate, that is SOFIA. So that is again incorrect because we're not talking about forwards in this context, right? And then you basically have your sterling overnight interbank average rate SONIA, right? So SONIA is again a possible option which has been looked at as an alternative reference rate to the LIBOR, which is going to be phased out by December 2021. That's the whole idea, right? So the RBI basically has also recommended or advised banks to basically stop using MIFOR, which is the Mumbai Interbank Forward Outright Rate as well, right? And because it has references to the LIBOR, and because LIBOR is going to be phased out, it's important that MIFOR also gets phased out in that context. So FBIL, which is the Financial Benchmarks India Limited, is the entity which basically publishes a lot of your rates on an ongoing basis. So it basically started publishing your daily MIFOR rates from 15th of June 2021, and your modified MIFOR rates as well from 30th June 2021. So this will continue for some time, so that any kind of legacy contracts that might be there, you may still require MIFOR for those, right? So that is the context. So purely from a transitioning standpoint. Now, if I understand the overall situation, RBI has clearly said that only those scenarios where it's not possible to, let's say, completely negate LIBOR or MIFOR, only in those dire situations can you continue using those rates. But wherever it is possible, you have to basically phase out these rates, is what the context is. Now, talking about the global scenario, around $260 trillion is there in contracts that are linked to your LIBOR, right? Among the basic 5 currencies that are under LIBOR, dollar will be the one which will be the last to be phased out, and that's expected to be around June 2023. Right, but all the remaining 4 currencies, be it your euro, your Swiss franc, talking about your sterling as well as your yen, all of these are expected to exit by December 2021. And when you talk about India's exposure from the LIBOR perspective, RBI estimated that to be around $331 billion. Right, that's a massive exposure overall. Right. So one another term which is there here, of course, is SONIA, which again is referring to an effective overnight interest rate that is paid by banks, of course. These are for your unsecured transactions in the British sterling market. That's the context firstly. And secondly, it is used for overnight funding for trades that occur in the off hours, off market hours, right? And represents the depth of the overnight business in the marketplace. So that's the context as far as SONIA is concerned. Right, and again, SOFR is the answer that I'm looking at. SONIA is more related to the British sterling market, and it talks about the off-market hours context-wise, right? So that's the difference, and that's why SOFR is the answer in this case and not SONIA. So now moving on to the next question, we basically are talking about who amongst the following is not a current chairperson or MD in LIC. So we know that MR Kumar is already there. Essentially, Mini Ipe was recently brought in. So obviously that is a context where I feel that Mukesh Kumar Gupta will be the answer that has to go out. So essentially BC Patnaik, Siddharth Mohanty and Rajkumar are all current MDs, and MR Kumar of course happens to be the chairman at this point in time. And let's look at the answers. Yeah, so MR Kumar is the chairperson. You have Pankaj Jain, who's the government nominee director. Then you have Rajkumar, who's a current managing director. Then Siddharth Mohanty, who's the managing director again. Then you have Mini Ipe, who's again a managing director recently brought in, and of course phenomenal in the context that she was also part of LIC HFL earlier, and she did great work there as well, and now she's become the managing director at LIC also. And then you talk about BC Patnaik, again another managing director. So these are the 4 guys who are the managing directors right now, and the chairperson is MR Kumar. So the answer obviously by elimination becomes Mukesh Kumar Gupta. Right, so Dr. Ranjan Sharma happens to be an independent director right now, and Shri Vinod Kumar Verma is again an independent director. So that's the list as of now, and this is the overall scheme of things, right? So currently not a chairperson or MD. The answer in this case happens to be Mukesh Kumar Gupta. Moving on to the next question, which of the following is not a scheme launched by Small Industries Development Bank of India in order to boost the economy during the COVID crisis? So here we're talking about Prayas. So this is the entity which was not brought in purely from the perspective of COVID. Obviously, it does benefit a lot of MSMEs, but overall, that was not the perspective with which it was launched, right? So when I talk about SIDBI, it basically came up with the Swavalamban Challenge Fund, or the SCF, and a Swavalamban Facilitation Center under its Prayas scheme for mentoring and providing credit to the MSMEs overall in terms of the villages and also the small towns through your microfinance institutions. So that was the purpose with which Prayas was created. Talking about the others, so Twarit, we are talking about the timely working capital assistance to revitalize industries in time of corona crisis. So this was under the emergency credit line guarantee scheme. So under the ECLGS is when Twarit happened. Then you talk about Shwas, which was the SIDBI assistance to your healthcare sector in the war against second wave of COVID-19. So interesting terminologies and the way they've created those the acronyms, very interesting overall, but the name is quite difficult to remember, but you should remember Swash and Twarit for sure. Then you talk about Arog, which is basically the SIDBI assistance to MSMEs for recovery and organic growth during the COVID-19 pandemic again, right? So that is Arog. Then again, you had Arise also coming in, which is the assistance to re-energize the capital investment by your SMEs. That also happened. And then you have Safe Plus, which is basically your SIDBI assistance to facilitate emergency response against coronavirus. So Safe and Safe Plus, both were in that context. And then you also had something called as the SLS2, which is the special liquidity support for the MSMEs. And within this, you had SLS launched for your NBFCs. Then you had SLS for your special refinance schemes. And then you also had a special liquidity scheme for the microfinance institutions as well. So all these were some of the initiatives taken up by SIDBI in the course of the last couple of years in the advent of ensuring that the companies and your MSMEs are able to survive the COVID pandemic, right? So these are some of the initiatives taken by SIDBI in that front. So Twarit, Shwas, Arog, SLS2 definitely fit into that category, but not Prayas, right? So moving on to the next question now, we're looking at question number 23. So the International Finance Corporation, that is IFC, has basically sanctioned a $250 million, approximately 1858 crores to to enhance the inexpensive housing finance in India, both in the case of affordable housing and also in terms of emerging green housing as well. So that is where HDFC Limited comes into the picture, and International Finance Corporation has sanctioned $250 million to HDFC Limited, right? So बाकी entities जो हैं, मतलब NHB is more from a government perspective. All the others have been in some kind of a negative news overall, and definitely not the answer in this case. So the context here is that this is in line with Government of India's vision of providing housing for all, right? So you were looking at green affordable housing, which can basically help India on its path to achieve the targets that it has agreed in the Paris Agreement in order to reduce a third of its carbon emissions by 2030 as compared to the 2005 levels. That's the whole context here. And when you talk about some of the other names in these options, you talk about your Piramal Enterprises subsidiary, which is your Piramal Capital and Housing Finance, PCHFL, has basically merged with the debt-ridden DHFL, which is your Dewan Housing Finance Limited, after of course paying rupees 34,250 crores to the creditors of the troubled housing finance company. So basically Piramal and DHFL have come together. Then in September 2018, you had another major crisis happening because of Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services Limited, as IL&FS, which basically defaulted on a lot of its debt obligations, and that basically triggered a massive liquidity crisis overall in the financial services market. And the government obviously had to act in a swift manner, and it kind of replaced the entire IL&FS board and basically handpicked nominees and placed them there. Another interesting development, if you talk about real estate, is the Evergrande case from a China standpoint, right? And this is what Uday Kotak tweeted about it. So he said that Evergrande basically seems like China's Lehman moment, right? So Lehman Brothers was the company which the US government could not decide whether it should let it stay afloat or should it actually let it fall. And eventually Lehman Brothers fell in 2008. So it was not bailed out. So Evergrande seems like China's Lehman moment, right? And reminds us of the IL&FS crisis also, talking about the Indian government acting swiftly at that point of time. So he kind of expects the Chinese government also to act swiftly in this case in order to ensure that there is calm in the financial markets. So the government, in the case of IL&FS at that point of time, had appointed a board, and around 61% of the debt was actually recovered post that, right? And he wanted to give a context of how bad the situation was by telling that the Evergrande bonds in China were basically trading at 25 cents to the dollar, which means that this obviously is an organization which has massive presence across every sector, predominantly real estate, of course, and then you obviously have to look at it from the perspective of how it is impacting the other sectors as well, and the employment that it has directly or indirectly generated, and the kind of impact that it may have if this is basically allowed to fall, just like Lehman Brothers. So that's the context with which Evergrande basically came into the picture, and I want to discuss some of these names as well. Okay, so let's now try and move on to the next question, and basically talks about the IMF's executive board basically looking to approve an equivalent to $650 billion of what is known as your special drawing rights. So now don't get confused with a currency here. It's not a currency. It's basically something as a benefit or a drawing that can be taken from the IMF by the members of the IMF. Think of it like a Robin Hood, right? So just a Robin Hood, अमीरों से लेके गरीब को देता था. Similarly, IMF kind of works in that fundamental that it picks it up, let's say contributions from the richer countries, and then basically helps the poorer countries in terms of coming up with various kinds of things that they can actually do to improve their situation in their poor countries. So that's the whole context as far as your special drawing rights are concerned, and that's to the tune of $650 billion overall. And of course, this is obviously a situation where it has been increased up till a point in time. It was a relatively lesser amount, and then during the global financial crisis, that was the first time IMF basically hiked the SDR or the special drawing rights to around $250 billion, and then subsequently now, because of the COVID pandemic, is when the next rise has happened, and this basically is one of the highest levels, right? So this is the highest level at which the SDR has been historically, right? So that is the context here. So basically, the idea is very simple: channel the SDRs from the wealthier nations, wealthier members, and basically give them to the poorer and the more vulnerable members, especially in the context of helping them recover from a COVID-19 standpoint. Next up, as I said, 2009 was the year in which a $250 billion expansion in SDR reserves was done in order to recover from the GFC, or the global financial crisis of 2008. And then specifically when I talk about an SDR is obviously an international reserve. It's not necessarily a currency. So it's an international reserve that has been created by the IMF in order to supplement the official reserves of the respective member countries that they may be having at any given point in time, right? So what it does is that it is a potential claim on the freely usable currencies of the IMF members, right? So basically your SDR right, or the special drawing right that you have, basically also depends on how much you have contributed, and that gives you a claim on, or that right gives you a claim on the member countries' currencies that are possibly there, right? And the equivalent is $650 billion as of August 2021, when this number was basically hiked. Now, if I look at it, the SDRs can basically provide a country with a reasonable amount of liquidity and security, especially in the context of any kind of a crisis situation, right? And which are the basket of currencies that basically define the SDR? Of course, you have the US dollar that is definitely there, the euro is there, the Chinese yuan is there, Japanese yen is there, and of course the British pound is there. And obviously there are several other currencies that come into the play, but these are the primary currencies that are there, right? So which is what I want to discuss in the context of the IMF's special drawing right of $650 billion that has been approved recently. This is the largest allocation in the IMF's history. Right, talking about some of the other terms, I think we've discussed the securitized loans in one of the earlier questions, and credit guarantee is nothing but a way to, let's say for example, if you're trying to construct something as an organization and you may want to borrow some money, right? Instead of the bank directly lending you money, if the bank says that, hey, you got to mortgage the asset that you're creating, right? Or come back with a guarantor, right? In some cases, what happens is, if let's say a multinational company is trying to set up, let's say some operations in India, and उस multinational company को India में उसके subsidiary के लिए अगर पैसा चाहिए, so many a times the banks would basically reach out to the headquarters or the parent company and say कि ये आपका जो company है, it is trying to establish operations in India, please give me a corporate guarantee जिसके basis पे हम यहाँ पे उनको function करने देंगे, right? So the Indian entity is basically borrowing the money, right, from a Indian bank, or let's say a foreign bank which has a subsidiary in India. This bank basically reaches out to the parent in the parent country and says that, boss, give me a corporate guarantee that in case your subsidiary, which is based out of India, fails to pay back the loan, then I can fall back on you and get my money back, right? So that is basically the process of invoking a guarantee. Invocation बोलते हैं उसको guarantee के केस में. So that is what credit guarantee is all about. Credit guarantee का मतलब है कि मैं उधार नहीं दे रहा हूँ, मैं guarantee कर रहा हूँ कि in case this person defaults, then I will ensure that you as a borrower will not be at a loss. I will pay you the money back in case this person defaults. That is what a credit guarantee is all about. So in this question, obviously it is not relevant. We're talking about the special drawing rights specifically because we're talking about the global economy, right? That is where SDR comes into the picture, and $650 billion is the correct answer. Right, so moving on to the next question. Which are the two entities that have basically inked India's first SOFR-linked external commercial borrowing, or ECB deal, which is done by replacing the LIBOR? So that's the context here. So obviously the options are fairly close in terms of a public sector bank and let's say an oil marketing company, or the combination of an oil marketing company cannot be my answer because one of them has to lend and the other has to borrow. So if both are oil marketing companies, that option cannot be my answer. So obviously it has to be one of these. And in generally these kind of things, whenever something new is happening or a trendsetter situation kind of scenario emerges, changes, then usually you'll find that SBI is usually at the forefront of it, because obviously it understands the guidelines a bit better than some of the other banks, because it's in a way a quasi-regulatory entity itself. Obviously, just after RBI, the next in terms of stature is SBI, right? So obviously you would expect some of these important first trend-setting deals to probably happen with SBI only. So now talking about the context, so this basically was pertaining to March 2021 when SBI and the IOCL basically inked a $100 million deal, to be precise, for a period of 5 years. And the first deal that has happened from an ECB or an external commercial borrowings standpoint, and this was linked to the new SOFR, which is your secured overnight financing rate, right? So that is what has been used in this context. Now going a little ahead, in June 2021, basically Axis Bank also went on to announce its first derivative transaction linked to the SOFR rate, obviously by replacing the LIBOR. Now, if I go back in terms of history in Jan itself, so what happened was that in March you had the first ECB transaction between SBI and IOCL, but in January itself there were some money market transactions that actually SBI did, right? So it basically executed two interbank short-term money market deals, right? And obviously the pricing in that case was also linked to SOFR. And then similarly, your ICICI Bank also executed one interbank money market transaction linked with SOFR way back in January 2021 itself. So money market deals January में ही हुए थे, but ECB related जो पहला deal था, that happened between SBI and IOCL, and that was in March 2021. Right. So quickly moving on to the next question, we're looking at question number 26 now. Now this is more a static question, right? But इसका relevance क्यों आता है current affairs के perspective में? Because there's a lot of new investments and stuff that the World Bank group and the World Bank specifically keeps on doing. So it's important to know कि भाई World Bank के entities कौन-कौन है, क्या है, and इससे related static question आ सकता है, because even though it is static, this is continuously in the news in some sort of a current affair. कहीं ना कहीं कुछ वर्ल्ड बैंक ने इन्वेस्टमेंट कर दिया, या IBRD ने इन्वेस्टमेंट कर दिया, या IDA ने इन्वेस्टमेंट कर दिया, and always comes into the picture. So it's important to know this, right? So question यहाँ पे है कि which of the following is not a वर्ल्ड बैंक ग्रुप एंटिटी, और इसका आंसर बहुत ही स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड. अगर आपको कुछ भी इंटरनेशनल फाइनेंशियल सर्विस सेंटर के बारे में पता है, IFSC के बारे में पता है, यू नो दैट दिस इज डेफिनेटली नॉट अ पार्ट ऑफ द वर्ल्ड बैंक ग्रुप. दिस इज वेरी वेरी क्लियर, राइट? बिकॉज दिस इज बेस्ड आउट ऑफ द GIFT City in Gujarat, and it is the quasi-regulatory body that is basically predominantly created to regulate the IFSC itself, right? That is the whole idea. Now, if I go back a bit, so your entities of World Bank Group, कौन-कौन से entities हैं? So first of all is your IBRD, which is your International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, right? And ये जो है, it is basically for your middle income and the credit-worthy low-income countries. So all kinds of loans and any kind of servicing that has to be provided from that perspective will be done by IBRD. Next up, we're talking about IDA, which is the International Development Association. राइट, सो टेक्निकली IBRD प्लस IDA ये दोनों मिला के ही आपका वर्ल्ड बैंक बनता है. That is the whole game here. Next thing is that IDA basically provides your interest-free loans, right? So they are providing interest-free loans, which are basically sometimes called as credits as well, and these are granted to the governments of the poorest of countries, right? So basically IBRD is more from a middle income and a credit-worthy low-income perspective, and IDA is purely from a low-income perspective, and poorest of countries को आप credits offer कर रहे हो at a what do you say, interest-free loans के type में. So that is what is your IDA, and IBRD plus IDA basically becomes your World Bank. Now talking about the next one, which is the IFC or the International Finance Corporation. अब ये क्या करता है? This entity obviously is the world's largest global development institution that is focusing specifically on the development of the private sector. राइट, so उसके रिलेटेड आपका सारा काम करता है ये, एंड टू हेल्प बेसिकली योर डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज अचीव अ सस्टेनेबल ग्रोथ बाय बेसिकली फाइनेंसिंग वेरियस काइंड्स ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट्स, मोबिलाइजिंग कैपिटल फॉर देम in terms of international financial markets also, and also providing advisory services to the businesses and the governments. So that is what your IFC does, which is your International Finance Corporation, purely for private players or private sector के perspective में. Next up, we're talking about MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. So this was basically created in 1988 to promote your FDI into the developing countries in order to support their economic growth. Obviously, idea was to reduce their poverty, improve the lives of the people living in those countries, and by offering a political risk insurance, right? So context is any investor who's investing in such kind of a country wants his capital to be protected, right? So from that perspective, political risk कहाँ से आया था? Because I'm not sure about that country and that political environment in that country. So there is a risk that if I invest money into that country, will that money come back? So what MIGA does is that it provides guarantee, right? कि अगर आपने पैसा invest किया तो वो पैसा एटलीस्ट प्रिंसिपल जो है प्रोटेक्टेड रहेगा. सो फ्रॉम दैट पर्सपेक्टिव यू आर सेइंग दैट मीगा प्रोवाइड्स योर गारंटी और अ political risk insurance in that sense, right? And this is to various kinds of investors and lenders, so to speak. So that is what your MIGA does. And then talking about your ICSID, which is your International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, as the name suggests. So obviously it is providing international facilities for various kinds of conciliation and arbitration that may be happening in order to avoid any kinds of massive disputes that might be there from an investment perspective, right? So उससे बचाने के लिए आप basically ICSID का इस्तेमाल करते हो. Purely dispute resolution mechanism है बड़ी से वर्ल्ड बैंक का. Then talking about IFSCA, which is basically the unified authority for the development of the guidelines and the regulations and the compliances of various kinds of financial products, financial services, and the financial institutions that will be operating in the International Financial Service Center, which is currently only in the GIFT City in Gujarat as of now in India, right? IFSCs globally हैं. You have one in London, you have one in Singapore, you have one in Hong Kong, and these are agencies which are actually benefiting the entire global markets, right? Because from Singapore you can actually trade all international markets. Technically India से भी बैठ के कर सकते हो, but IFSC, because it is called an International Financial Service Center, provides a lot of ease of operations on multiple perspectives. That is what IFSC brings to the table. India में currently अभी GIFT City में है, गुजरात में, and उसका जो regulatory authority है, that is called as IFSCA. So basically अगर आप situation देखें तो IFSCA came into existence to act as the regulatory body for IFSC. So prior to the establishment of IFSCA, technically all the regulatory functions were being managed by your RBI, SEBI, PFRDA, ADAI, सारे के सारे अपने अपने regulatory काम देखते थे. Once IFSCA came into existence, technically it became the whole and sole regulatory body, which means it is equal to RBI plus SEBI plus PFRDA plus ADAI for the IFSC in Gujarat. That is the whole context. So it is playing multiple roles from a regulatory standpoint. So that's the answer in this case. So obviously IFSCA is not linked to the World Bank, right? So to sum it up, when I talk about the World Bank group, we're essentially talking about IBRD and IDA, which combined together form the World Bank. Then you talk about the International Finance Corporation, then you talk about ICSID and MIGA, which are the other three entities. So totally putting it up to 5 entities which are part of the World Bank group, right? So moving on to the next question now. We're looking at 10 major banks, including SBI and ICICI, formed something which was basically an online platform for trading your corporate loans in the market, which basically had Sanjay Srivastava as the chairman. So which was this thing that they created? They basically created something called as the SLMA, or the Secondary Loan Market Association. The objective was very simple, कि Secondary Loan Market Association, because it has multiple banks as a part of it, is a SRO, or a self-regulatory organization or self-regulatory body, right? And it has been formed by the recommendation of the RBI Task Force on the development of the secondary markets in terms of corporate loans. Secondary market का मतलब क्या है कि अगर आप एक corporate loan as a borrower, you are a corporate and you borrow a loan from a bank, then essentially the bank holds that loan in its books as a security, and because I'm creating a secondary loan market association, I'm trying to say that okay, I can go and purchase this loan as a security from the secondary market. That's the whole idea. Until now, this was not necessarily happening from an Indian market's perspective. So SLMA's website and logo, all of this was digitally designed by Saurav Sinha, who's the executive director at the RBI. Now the context is that the current members that you have is SBI, ICICI, Canara, Standard Chartered, then you have Kotak Mahindra, then you have Deutsche Bank, you have Bank of Baroda, Punjab National Bank, Axis, and HDFC. All of these are the current members as far as your SLMA is concerned. Now, up till now, what was happening was that all your banks and your NBFCs were the only participants in the primary market. Primary market का मतलब क्या है कि banks and NBFCs जो हैं वो primarily loan lend करेंगे या loan देंगे for corporates. Right? That was the primary market. अब secondary market के लिए भी क्या होता था कि it was only the banks or NBFCs who could buy these loans from other banks. Right? और asset reconstruction companies buy कर सकते थे. हमने context समझा है इसका. Obviously you have NARCL, which has been recently created, National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited, that has basically been formed from that perspective only कि सारे के सारे जो non performing assets हैं या bad loans हैं उनको NARCL को shift कर दिए जाएंगे. Right? That was the whole idea, and banks in turn will basically get some security receipts in return for that. But context क्या है कि up till now it was only the banks, NBFCs who could basically trade these loans, right? आपस में खरीद सकते थे जो भी थे, right? So and asset reconstruction companies को involve कर सकते थे. That was the only thing that used to happen up till this point of time. But because of the Secondary Loan Market Association, what you're saying is that you are creating a secondary market also for your corporate loans, जहाँ पे आप उसको वहाँ से भी online से access कर सकते हो, right? Because it's the online portal. So banks that are participating in the secondary market, they are essentially doing that only through the interbank transactions, right? Transferring the loan accounts from one bank to the other, ऐसे ही चल रहा था अभी तक तो, right? Or by the sale of the stressed assets to the ARCs. That's exactly the process that's happening through NARCL as well. But ये जो है SLMA will create a secondary market for corporate loans, जहाँ पे आपके investors जो हैं वो भी उसमें participate कर सकते हैं. It could basically be providing access through the domestic as well as foreign investors as well. So that is something which is being created now. Let's see कि इसका कैसा response आता है, right? So that is what SLMA is all about. Moving on to the next question. Again, in 2021, SEBI basically provided an in-principle approval to the following entities to launch their mutual funds business, except. So questions हमेशा ध्यान से पढ़ो क्या पूछा जा रहा है, right? So I remember reading about Bajaj Finserv जिनको अभी म्यूचुअल फंड लाइसेंस मिला, Samco Securities को भी लाइसेंस मिला है, and Zerodha, again a trading account that I already used, so Zerodha has also received the mutual fund business license from SEBI. So definitely these are my answers. Kotak Mahindra has already been what do you say, asset reconstruction or asset management company rather. So इसको लाइसेंस इस साल मिलने का कोई कॉन्टेक्स्ट नहीं बनता, right? So the answer has to be in this case C, which is the one which is not got a license this year, right? So the context is that if you look at the SEBI regulations, Bajaj Finserv basically will set up an asset management company and a trustee company as well, either directly or indirectly through Bajaj Finserv या फिर किसी और entity के through करेंगे in order to sponsor that mutual fund. And the current chairman managing director is Sanjeev Bajaj. Then talking about the entire situation as far as Samco Securities is concerned, so it also received SEBI's approval to launch its mutual fund business. So essentially it was founded by Jimit Modi, who's currently the CEO as well. So what it did was it acquired Samriddhi Stockbrokers and converted and rechristened the name to Samco Securities. So that's what happened in case of Samco Securities getting a mutual fund license. Then in September 2021, you basically also had India's largest brokerage firm, that is Zerodha. Obviously, a lot of retail investors have basically ended up opening their accounts there, which also received an in-principle approval to set up an AMC in India. So all these three entities have received approvals for the mutual fund business. Now, the context is that Kotak Mahindra AMC was basically barred or banned for the next 6 months to basically create any new products under their FMP line of products, which is your fixed maturity plan. Right? तो इसमें बेसिकली उनको बोला गया भैया कि you made some errors, you made what do you say, some regulatory breaches, because of which we are basically banning you from creating or launching any new FMPs for the next 6 months. That's what RBI said, and that's why Kotak Mahindra AMC was in the news. So extending this discussion further, Zerodha का major competitor कौन है इस market में? We talk about Grow, which is an online platform जिसका जो backing है उस company का नाम है Next Billion Technology Private Limited. So Next Billion Technology or Grow basically also got an approval from the Competition Commission of India to acquire India Bulls Asset Management Company. So technically Grow also has entered the mutual fund business through an acquisition route, right? So that's the context that I wanted to discuss. So all of these, Bajaj Finserv, Samco Securities and Zerodha got their mutual fund business license, and then Grow basically came through the acquisition route of India Bulls Mutual Funds, right? Or India Bulls Asset Management Company. So that is what I had to discuss in terms of question number 28. Let's move on to question 29. It says, as per the EASE Reforms Index, that is EASE 3.0, अभी तो EASE 4.0 आ चुका है, which bank was ranked first in this specific category, that is smart lending for aspiring India, right? So the answer in this case, whenever you talk about smart lending, is think of the kind of stuff these banks have done. So technically, SBI has also done good work with SBI Yono. Then you talk about BOB, because it came up with BOB World, which is a fantastic mobile app in itself, right? So technically, competition would have been between BOB and SBI. So I think because you're talking about smart lending and aspiring India, so that brand consciousness from BOB perspective fits better, that's why BOB fits in as the answer. Let's try and check if we are correct or not. So essentially, when you look at the overall index awards, what exactly happened? So the overall achievement in terms of PSBs was that SBI was first as expected, second was Bank of Baroda, third was Union Bank of India, right? Then in terms of best improvement in terms of the March baseline performance, any year on year में maximum improvement किसने दिखाया? The answer in this case was that the first in this case was Indian Bank, which had shown the maximum improvement in terms of baseline performance. Second was Union Bank of India, and third was Punjab National Bank, right? So these are some specific categories or major segments of the awards. Now going into the specific theme-wise awards for the top 3 award-winning public sector banks. So essentially, smart lending wale category mein for aspiring India, first was Bank of Baroda, then SBI, then UBI. Again, thought process अगर आप सोच के देखें कि हर एक बैंक की positioning कैसे है, you'll realize that BOB should have actually won this award. It has. Then you talk about tech-enabled ease of banking. Ideally, I think no one can beat the online portal that SBI has, and also SBI YONO in that sense. So tech-enabled ease of banking, I think SBI is right up there. Second, obviously, will be Bank of Baroda and Union Bank of India. Then basically you're looking at institutionalizing prudent banking, which means practical thought processes and good processes in place, key operating procedures, sab kuch likh ke rakhna, all those things, and ensuring that it is adhered to. From that perspective, Bank of Baroda was first, Punjab National Bank was second, and then your Canara Bank was third in that sense. Then governance and outcome centric HR. So in this case, it was Union Bank of India, PNB, and SBI. And then the last category was deepening the financial inclusion and customer protection. So from this perspective, this is a surprise winner that you have Union Bank of India as the number one in terms of deepening financial inclusion. Second is SBI and third is Bank of Baroda. Right. So next, moving on to the next question, we're talking about which of the following statements pertaining to e-rupee is actually incorrect, right? So what we know about e-rupee is that this was obviously launched by Shri Narendra Modi, and it's basically a person and purpose specific instrument. We know that किसी एक purpose के लिए, मतलब obviously purpose can be defined, but it can be used only for a specific purpose, and it is limited to that person. That's the context, right? And it is a one-time cashless and contactless digital payment that is there. And these are basically vouchers that have been developed by NPCI, of course, on its UPI platform. So I think nothing wrong in this particular option. This seems correct to me. Obviously, which are the entities that have been associated with NPCI in terms of creation? Obviously, you have DFS, which is the Department of Financial Services, NHA, which is the National Health Authority, definitely as part of this. And then you also have MOHFW, which is the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, obviously should be a part of it, and partner banks as well. So this comes by common sense कि ये लोग ideally association में होने चाहिए. Then the tricky part here is that it says beneficiary needs to share personal details, especially in today's context wherein we are saying कि जितना information sharing कम हो उतना better है. Especially हम बात करते हैं आपके NBFC account aggregators की, राइट, जहाँ पे हम बोलते हैं कि कस्टमर का कंसेंट बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है उनका शेयर करने से पहले, इन्फॉर्मेशन शेयर करने से पहले. सो फ्रॉम दैट पर्सपेक्टिव डेटा प्राइवेसी इज ऑफ एक्सट्रीम इंपॉर्टेंस टुडे. सो दिस ऑप्शन इज कंप्लीटली कॉन्ट्रेरियन टू दैट, राइट? सो इवन विदाउट रीडिंग द अदर ऑप्शंस आई कैन से दैट बॉस बेनिफिशियरी does not need to share personal details. How can you share your personal details here, right? So it does not make any sense to me whatsoever. So this cannot be my option in any case, right? And that's my answer, right? This is the incorrect one. Let's look at the other ones as well, just to confirm. लीक प्रूफ डिलीवरी ऑफ गवर्नमेंट वेलफेयर सब्सिडीज, एब्सोल्युटली जिसको इंटेंडेड है उसको मिलना चाहिए, और जिस पर्पस के लिए इंटेंडेड है उस पर्पस के लिए यूज होना चाहिए. एग्जैक्टली. एंड इंश्योर दैट द मनी एलोकेटेड इज यूज फॉर दैट स्पेसिफिक नीड. परफेक्ट है, ये पॉइंट भी कवर हो गया. देन सर्विस प्रोवाइडर विल बी पेड इमीडिएटली. क्यों? बिकॉज ये ऑलरेडी प्रीपेड इंस्ट्रूमेंट है, तो ऑटोमेटिकली वो पेमेंट जो है जैसे ही ट्रांजैक्शन कंप्लीट होगा, then the voucher is basically going to be prepaid to that service provider. So all of that makes a lot of sense, right? So basically on 2nd of August 2021, Prime Minister Narendra Modi virtually inaugurated a prepaid electronic voucher based digital payment solution known as your e-rupee to strengthen the DBT or the direct benefit transfer that's happening in the country, and including the unbanked citizens into the financial ecosystem. So the idea was how to get the unbanked citizens into the financial gamut of things. How do you make them a part of this entire revolution? That is where your e-rupee has definitely played a good role, and obviously will play a good role in the coming years as well, right? So obviously these vouchers have been created for very specific purposes. They cannot be transferred or they cannot be cashed out also, so that वो जो अनवांटेड पॉसिबिलिटीज होते हैं वो आप कर ही नहीं सकते इसमें, राइट? एंड देयर इज नो नीड टू प्रिंट द वाउचर एज वेल. फोन पे काम हो जाएगा, एंड वाउचर्स कैन बी रिडीम्ड बाय द एंड बेनिफिशियरी ओनली, राइट? सो इट्स वेरी वेरी क्लियर इन टर्म्स ऑफ यूसेज, इन टर्म्स ऑफ पर्सन, एवरीथिंग. सो इट्स प्योरली सॉर्टेड फ्रॉम दैट पर्सपेक्टिव, राइट? So moving on to the next question, question number 31. So the first edition of the global DeFi, which is basically your decentralized finance, मतलब central location पे finance concentrated ना होते हुए, basically it is spread across regions within a country, within a region itself. So that is what is your DeFi, right? So basically talking about the DeFi adoption index. This was basically released by a global blockchain data firm, which is known as your Chainalysis, right? And to highlight basically the countries where you have the highest grassroots adoption when it comes to your individuals, rather than focusing only on those sending the largest raw value of funds, right? So rather than volume, this analysis is trying to focus on the countries where the individuals are basically adopting the decentralized finance mechanisms more. That was the whole idea. Now the question is, which was the country that was ranked second? So let's look at the overall ranking. So there were around 154 countries in this. So obviously, as expected, the country which is best in this at this point of time is US. Second is Vietnam, which is doing phenomenal well. Then third is Thailand. Again, quite a phenomenal achievement considering that China and UK are fourth and fifth, and India basically ranks sixth in terms of your DeFi adoption index. Right, so the country which is ranked second is basically Vietnam. Right, so moving on to the next question, we're looking at NIPL, which is the international arm of NPCI. So we know that it basically partnered with RMA, or the Royal Monetary Authority of Bhutan, to implement the Bharat interface for money, which is the UPI QR based payments in Bhutan. Obviously, Bhutan became the first country to basically tie up with NIPL also in that context, right? And the idea is, which entity has now tied up with NIPL, or which bank, so to speak, has now tied up with NIPL, so that the mobile-based real-time payment systems can be adopted in the UAE as well. So the answer in this case happens to be Mashreq Bank, which has tied up with NIPL from a UAE standpoint. So if you look at the context, in July 2021, Bhutan became the first country to adopt India's UPI standards for its QR deployments. Then talking about NIPL, NIPL obviously is a wholly owned subsidiary of NPCI, and it has been devoted to the deployment of various kinds of NPCI indigenous products and services to global counterparts, right? So basically that's what it's trying to do. So your real-time payment system, UPI, and the card scheme, RuPay, all of it, it's trying to promote them outside of India. So this was established on 3rd of April 2020, and the current CEO happens to be Ritesh Shukla, right? So that is basically the context as far as NIPL is concerned. As far as Mashreq Bank is concerned, it is headquartered in Dubai, UAE, and the group CEO at this point of time is Ahmed Abdelal, right? So that's the context on NIPL tying up with RMA first, and now with Mashreq Bank UAE. Question number 33 now. NABARD has basically signed a memorandum of understanding with who, right? That's the whole context. And we're talking about the Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh to basically finance 1000 joint liability group. Joint liability group का मतलब क्या है कि आप बैंक के पास जाते हो बोरो करने के लिए, बट अकेले नहीं जाते हो. यू आर अ ग्रुप ऑफ 4 to 10 मेंबर्स, एंड आप साथ में बोरो करते हो, तो जो लायबिलिटी होती है वो कलेक्टिव लायबिलिटी होती है. तो इसका फायदा क्या होता है कि पीयर प्रेशर में कई बार अगर आप लोन का अमाउंट ना पे करना चाहो, तो उससे बाकी जो मेंबर्स हैं उनको भी नुकसान हो सकता है. सो एज अ रिजल्ट जो क्रेडिट वर्दीनेस होती है उस ग्रुप की, इट इज स्ट्रॉन्गर देन द सिंगल बोरोवर, right? Because the chances of default will go down, because you know that if I default, then the others will also suffer, right? So that's the reason why others will also ensure that koi default na kare. So that is the whole context of a joint liability group, right? And the idea was to enhance the flow of credit to your tenant farmers, your oral lessees, sharecroppers, SMF, or basically your small and marginalized farmers, and obviously looking at benefiting around 5,000 households in Jammu and Kashmir. So इसमें context ये है कि किस किस के साथ ये MOU साइन किया गया है. तो बेसिकली इट हैज बीन साइंड विद SBI, and it's not Jammu and Kashmir Bank, but it is Jammu and Kashmir Grameen Bank, right? That is where the confusion could possibly be. So the answer in this case is JKGB and SBI, both of them put together, right? So the idea is very simple. The people who are suffering from reverse migration during the COVID-19 pandemic will be provided with the credit facilities through the joint liability group formation, right? And this MOU was basically signed or either presided over by AK Sood, who's the Chief General Manager of NABARD, Surendra Singh, General Manager NABARD again, then Ajitav Parashar, Deputy General Manager of SBI, and Sudhir Gupta, who's the Chairman of Jammu and Kashmir Grameen Bank. All of them participated and represented the various MOU entities in NABARD, SBI, and Jammu and Kashmir Grameen Bank, right? So that's the context in question number 33. Moving on to the next question, we're looking at International Financial Service Center Authority, IFSCA. We've discussed this already in one of the earlier questions. So here, the chairperson of IFSCA, Injeti Srinivas, basically has launched the pilot run or soft launch of one of these exchanges, which will act as a gateway for bullion imports into India. Right, so bullion refers to obviously your gold and silver and other kinds of similar commodities. That's the whole context there. Now, which are the options that could possibly fit in? So technically, NSE, BSE, IFSC does not really make sense. MCX is a multi-commodity exchange. India INX is again an international exchange. Looks like IBEX is the most possible answer, because it again has a full form, which is International Bullion Exchange. So that is the answer which fits in perfectly in this context. right? So all the bullion imports that are there for domestic consumption will basically be channelized through IBEX itself. That will be the whole context. So how it will work is that there will be a holding company, which is basically referred to as IIBH in this case, which will be your India International Bullion Holding IFSC Limited, and this was formed to set up and to operationalize International Bullion Exchange, or IBEX as it is called, in the IFSC Gift City in Gujarat. Now, how has it worked? Essentially, there has been an MOU that has been signed with the multiple exchanges that are there. So obviously, which are the exchanges involved? Obviously, these are your usual suspects. You have your NSE, you have your MCX, which is the Multi Commodity Exchange of India Limited. Then you have India INX International Exchange. Then you also have the depositories, NSDL and CDSL, as part of the MOU itself, right? So basically, launching the India Bullion Exchange. This was basically inaugurated by the IFSCA chairperson Injeti Srinivas, right? So that's question number 34 for you. Moving on to 35, it says, which of the following entities cannot be categorized as a crypto unicorn at present? So which means any company which has a valuation of greater than $1 billion is basically categorized as a unicorn. India has a host of unicorns right now, especially in the last 2 years. We've had massive number of companies turning unicorn from an India standpoint. Now, which are the two crypto entities which have become unicorns, right? So the first one was CoinDCX. And then recently, again, it was CoinSwitch Kuber. So both of these have become unicorns in their own right. So which of these cannot be categorized? That is WazirX. It is still to become a unicorn in this space, which means that its valuation is still less than $1 billion. So understanding a bit about these entities, so your cryptocurrency exchange, which is CoinDCX, it was basically valued at $1.1 billion when it basically picked up $90 million funding in a round that was led by the Facebook co-founder Eduardo Severin's fund, which is basically called as B Capital, right? And its existing investors, which is your Coinbase Ventures, Polychain Capital, Block.one, Jump Capital, and others, also invested in that round. So if, let's say, your existing investors are also putting in money, it kind of tells you that this company has strong growth prospects, because the existing investors are not looking to cash out, but they're willing to invest more, which means that they expect something phenomenal to happen from the company, right? So which is a good sign from any startup's perspective if the existing investors continue to keep investing, right? Next thing in the context of CoinDCX is that it has founders as Neeraj Khandelwal and Sumit Gupta. Now, the other thing which I want to discuss from the perspective of the CoinSwitch Kuber, which is the second entity which has become a unicorn now, is basically that it's a Bangalore-based entity, and it basically picked up a Series C funding round, which was worth $260 million, which was led by US venture capital firm A16Z, that is part of the Andreessen Horowitz group, and then basically again Coinbase Ventures. Why have I marked Coinbase Ventures? Because Coinbase Ventures is actually an investor in both your CoinDCX and your CoinSwitch Kuber itself, right? So दोनों में उन्होंने invest किया हुआ है इस investor ने. So by picking up this $260 million funding, what has happened is that CoinSwitch Kuber has basically overtaken CoinDCX in terms of its valuation, wherein currently it is valued at $1.9 billion, right? So having said that, obviously CoinDCX का valuation could have increased further in the last couple of months, but disclosed valuation जो है when it picked up its funding was at $1.1 billion, and disclosed valuation जो है CoinSwitch Kuber का when it got funding is at basically $1.9 billion. And again, good thing about CoinSwitch Kuber also is that the existing investors participated in the subsequent round, which is your Paradigm. You talk about Ribbit Capital, Sequoia Capital, and Tiger Global also participated in this funding round. So that's the context there. Who are the founders here? You have basically Vimal Sagar Tiwari, Govind Soni, and Ashish Singhal, who are the co-founders as far as your CoinSwitch Kuber is concerned. So now talking about the third entity in question, which is WazirX. So WazirX is basically part of all other local unit of Binance, which is a global world's largest crypto exchange in that context, right? And it has a crypto trading platform focused on Bitcoin, but it also has its own tokens as well, which is basically called as your WRX, right? So that is the context as far as WazirX is concerned. And basically, when I look at the co-founders from a WazirX standpoint, that's basically Nishil Shetty, Siddharth Menon, and Samir Matre. So essentially, this is what I want to discuss in the context of this particular question, wherein your CoinDCX and CoinSwitch Kuber are the two entities in the crypto space which have become unicorns in this year. Hopefully, WazirX will also probably reach in that direction. Another thing to very carefully look at in this perspective is that existing investors are pulling in more money. it is expected that in the winter session of the parliament, there will be a bill which basically will discuss about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and blockchain and a lot of other things as well. So there are a lot of, headwinds that are expected to come in this direction. But these companies are still quite positive in the sense that they feel that the mindset of the finance ministry and the team has actually been more accepting now than what it was earlier, which means that इसमें कुछ positive चीजें निकल के आ सकती हैं. That is what is expected. Obviously, a lot of regulations will also come in. So we wait for those regulations to come in, but till that time, these companies, these entities are trying to consolidate. They're trying to build greater financial literacy in terms of understanding blockchain, understanding Bitcoin. So वो सब काम ये लोग अच्छे से कर रहे हैं, and they're also building their user base also, right? So from that perspective, this industry is actually shaping up quite well, right? So moving further, we talk about question 36 now. The financial services platform Dash has signed a strategic partnership with Amazon India to offer collateral-free working capital loans to your e-commerce merchants, specifically your Amazon merchants across India. So अब कौन सा entity है जिसने Amazon के साथ tie-up किया है? So the answer in this case happens to be Incred, which has tied up with Amazon to offer collateral free. Collateral free का मतलब होता है कि उसमें कोई चीज गिरवी रखने की जरूरत नहीं है. It is free of collateral. So that is being offered by entity Incred, which is basically a financial services platform, and that is offering these services to your merchants of Amazon, right? So technically, the context here is that there will be working capital loan up to rupees 50 lakhs that will be offered to the merchants through the Incred seller portal that is there. And talking about Incred, the founder and CEO is Bhupinder Singh. So talking about the other entities here, so FamPay and Visa basically tied up to basically launch India's first doodle-based cards. So that is something which FamPay and Visa created together. Then Drip Capital and your SBM Bank India, they basically came together to empower your MSME exporters by offering customized trade finance solutions to them specifically, right? So that is what your Drip Capital and SBM India came up together. Now talking about Frio, which is basically India's first credit-led neobank. Neobank का मतलब है नया टाइप का बैंक जो डिजिटल मोड में ऑपरेट करता है, डिजिटल ओनली मोड में ऑपरेट करता है, या मोर स्पेसिफिकली मोबाइल बेस्ड ऑपरेशंस पे फोकस करता है, राइट? सो Frio is basically India's first credit-led neobank, has made a partnership with HDBFS, which is basically your HDB Financial Services, and the idea is to provide two credit products such as your credit line and a high ticket personal loan, right? And these are the two products that will be provided for the customers across multiple cities in India. So credit line bhi milegi in the form of an overdraft, and also a high ticket personal loan as well. So that's a tie-up between HDB Financial Services and your Frio, which is India's first credit-led neobank, right? Talking about the next one, which is basically Razorpay. So Razorpay basically in partnership with MasterCard launched again a recurring payment interface, which is basically known as your Mandate HQ, right? So इसका फंडा क्या है कि ये आपको recurring payments करने के लिए allow करेगा, such as your mobile bills, utility bills, and various kinds of subscription-led things for your customers. So that is what Razorpay has tied up with MasterCard to do, right? So that brings us to question number 37 now. So essentially, SBI has launched a special feature in its digital banking platform, YONO, which is You Only Need One, or YONO Lite, which is the lighter version of the app, right? So this technology or this feature allows only one user per device with a RMN or a registered mobile number. And obviously, it is basically aimed to protect you against any kinds of digital frauds that may happen, right? That's the whole context. So what it is actually. So it's definitely not card linking. It is not RMN connector. Tokenization is happening across the industry, wherein in order to protect data, a lot of the information that is available, let's say credit card numbers, account numbers, all of them are getting converted into tokens, right, which are encrypted data formats. So tokenization is definitely happening across the industry. But in this case, when you're specifically talking about a registered mobile number and only one user per device, it sounds more like a binding activity. So which is what you're doing in the SIM binding that it is called, right? So that's the answer in this particular case. So SIM binding feature will basically work with the basic rule of one mobile device, one user, and one registered mobile number. So that is how it will work. That's the combination there. Now, obviously, if you're someone who does well in the mains exam for SBI PO, you need to download the YONO app and read everything about it and know inside out of the YONO app. Install कर लो phone पे, अच्छे से इसको समझ लो क्या है करके, because उस पे questions definitely आएंगे. And it's obviously a good app which has done very well overall. So SBI YONO is basically the integrated digital banking platform of SBI. and it is India's first comprehensive digital service platform जहाँ पे सब कुछ आप कर सकते हो on the mobile banking platform itself. And this was basically launched on 10th of December 2017 by the former finance minister Arun Jaitley ji, right? So that is how it came into being. That was way back in 2017. But the app is now far more sophisticated than what it was at that point of time and offers the entire gamut of banking services on the fingertips on the phone itself, right? So which is where a lot of questions can be expected in the interview, especially if you're someone who basically makes it to the next stage as far as SBI PO mains is concerned, right? So that's what I want to discuss in terms of question 37. Let's quickly move on to question number 38, which basically said that SEBI recently allowed which category of banks to carry out all the activities of investment bankers in order to ease the access for investors to participate in public as well as rights issues by using various payment avenues. So obviously evident है कि अगर आप allow कर रहे हो payments करने के लिए for people to participate in IPOs, FPOs and rights issues, obviously the permission लॉजिकल सेंस बनता है कि आप पेमेंट्स बैंक्स को ही परमिशंस दोगे. शेड्यूल कमर्शियल बैंक्स के पास ऑलरेडी वो परमिशन है बिकॉज दे आर द वंस आर ऑपरेटिंग इन दैट कॉन्टेक्स्ट, राइट? सो मेक्स अ लॉट ऑफ लॉजिकल सेंस फॉर पेमेंट्स बैंक्स टू गेट दैट परमिशन बिकॉज जो भी लोड है शेड्यूल कमर्शियल बैंक्स पे ओवरऑल वो काफी हद तक ईज आउट हो जाएगा, राइट? सो ऑब्वियसली इन दैट कॉन्टेक्स्ट गिविंग स्पेसिफिक राइट्स और परमिशंस टू अलाउ योर payments banks to operate in this space will be definitely good for the overall industry itself, right? So that definitely helps, and payments banks का penetration levels in terms of financial inclusion भी काफी ज़्यादा है, so वो भी help करेगा. So the other thing is that the non-scheduled payments banks who've also got prior approval from the RBI, they are also eligible to basically act as bankers to an issue. So question अगला आता है कि BTI क्या होता है? What is a banker to an issue, right? So basically any scheduled commercial bank or any other entity, financial institution which has basically got a approval from SEBI to act as a banker to an issue, it will basically be allowed to collect application money, allotment money, सारा का सारा पैसा जो भी आप rights issue में या फिर IPOs में पैसा आता है वो सारा का सारा collection करने का, and then let's say refunding any amount in case the allocation does not happen. All of those services can basically be provided by your bankers to an issue. Obviously, you will be aware of the other concepts in this case as well, right? So you talk about ASBA and you talk about your self-certified syndicate banks, right? So ASBA obviously is application supported by blocked amount, which means that this facility is become now mandatory, wherein you have to ensure that all your bids have basically got to come through the ASBA, and that has to be facilitated by your self-certified syndicate banks, जो कि आपका पैसा जो है डायरेक्टली इशूअर को नहीं देंगे, वो आपका पैसा आपके अकाउंट में ही ब्लॉक करके रखेंगे. अगर मान लीजिए आपने IPO में अप्लाई किया है, so all your money pertaining to the bid that you have put in, जितना पैसा आपने बिड किया है, price and to the number of quantity that you have bid, that much will be blocked into your account, right? So this is application supported by blocked amount. अब इसका एडवांटेज क्या है कि इन केस एलोकेशन होता है, सो आप पैसा देने से मुकर नहीं सकते. यू हैव टू पे दैट मनी, सो दैट ब्लॉक्ड अमाउंट विल बी पास्ड ऑन टू द इशूअर, एंड इन केस यू डू नॉट गेट एन अलॉटमेंट, यू डोंट हैव टू वेट फॉर द मनी टू कम बैक फ्रॉम द इशूअर ऑल्सो, राइट? पहले क्या होता था कि पैसा चला जाता था, फिर 20-20, 30-30 दिन तक आपको वेट करना है पैसा आने के लिए. अभी ऐसा कोई फंडा नहीं है. सो एसबा विल एंश्योर दैट द मनी कम्स बैक टू यू इमीडिएटली बिकॉज वो आपके ही अकाउंट में पड़ा है. ओनली थिंग इट वॉज लॉक्ड, राइट? So that was blocked at this point of time, so that amount will become unblocked if the allocation does not happen to you. That's the context as far as ASBA and self-certified syndicate banks is concerned. Just an additional bit of concept from a perspective of rights issues and IPOs, because we were discussing about bankers to an issue, so ASBA or SCSB भी discuss करना definitely logical sense बनता है, right? So moving on to question number 39. Which entity became the first insurance company in India to integrate with NPCI's UPI AutoPay? So अपने आप इंश्योरेंस प्रीमियम डिडक्ट करने का बेसिकली क्या तरीका है, वो बेसिकली टाई अप हुआ है ICICI Prudential Life के साथ with NPCI. So it becomes the first insurance company or life insurance company to basically get into this with NPCI, right? And basically क्या किया उन्होंने, कस्टमर्स को इंस्टेंट ऑटोमेटेड रिकरिंग प्रीमियम पेमेंट्स ऑफ इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसीज के लिए रास्ता बता दिया है. ऑटोमेटिकली वो पेमेंट्स आपके NPCI के UPI के थ्रू हो जाएंगे. दैट्स द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ ICICI Pru, राइट? वाइल परचेसिंग द इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी, द कस्टमर कुड ऑल्सो बेसिकली लिंक देयर बैंक अकाउंट विद द UPI ऑटोपे and basically activate the e-mandate, right? So recurring payments को हम e-mandates बोलते हैं, and this can be done through the benefit of the mobile phone itself, and basically आपका जो e-mandate है recurring mode में activate हो जाएगा, right? So the first insurance company in India to tie up with NPCI's UPI AutoPay, that is basically your ICICI Prudential Life, right? So moving on to the Final question of the mock: which two entities have entered into a partnership in order to facilitate a dual display UPI at Shoppers Stop? Which means that आप basically उस ऐप के थ्रू QR कोड को स्कैन करके डबल वे डिस्प्ले का इस्तेमाल करके आप पेमेंट्स कर सकते हो. That is the whole context. So in specifically the case of Shoppers Stop, the tie-up has been between Innovity and PhonePe, right? So Innovity Payment Solutions, which basically is India's largest provider of payment solutions to your enterprise merchants. Enterprise merchants मतलब जो B2B segment में operate करते हैं, enterprise merchants. And then your PhonePe, which is obviously India's largest digital payment platform overall. And they have partnered together to provide the dual display UPI facility, which basically creates a dynamic QR code जो होता है उसके अंदर आपके सारे के सारे details होते हैं with regards to that payment, right? जो payment amount है, merchant के credentials जो हैं, right? And a secure transaction token एक generate होता है and उस QR को scan करके आप automatically payments कर सकते हो, right? So essentially this is a tie-up between PhonePe and your Innovity Payment Solutions to enable your dual display UPI transactions, and this is more specifically for all the Shoppers Stops outlet pan India. So next we talk about PayU and WooCommerce. So essentially PayU, which is again an online payment solutions provider, right? And WooCommerce, which is an open source customizable e-commerce platform, right? And these two have tied up to enable WooCommerce merchants, so the small and medium businesses that are there who are customers for WooCommerce. They can basically have a digital payments infrastructure and will be allowed to have end-to-end digitized business processes. So that is a tie-up between PayU and WooCommerce for WooCommerce's small and medium businesses that are customers for WooCommerce, right? Next up, we're talking about Ujjivan Small Finance Bank, right? And this basically offers loans on the LoanTap platform, and the loans could range anywhere between rupees 1 lakh to rupees 10 lakh with a maximum tenure of 48 months. So essentially, all personal loans can basically be obtained through LoanTap, which is going to be the app provider in this case, and Ujjivan Small Finance Bank will provide the credit facilities from that context. So that's a tie-up between LoanTap and Ujjivan Small Finance Bank. Next up, the tie-up we are talking about is Flexi Loans, which has become a tie-up with the Google Pay itself, right, to offer digital and feasible loans to your small and medium enterprises. So this is Flexi Loan, which is a MSME focused digital lending platform that is there, and becomes the first digital lending platform to have tied up with Google Pay in that sense. So that is the tie-up between Flexi Loans and Google Pay. So now talking about the last tie-up or understanding of strategic alliance that we are talking about in this question, we are looking at the digital lender non-banking financial company Pressed Loans, which has signed a strategic alliance with YouGrow Capital to basically provide your secured business loans to your MSMEs. The product offering is basically Grow Micro, which is a product of YouGrow Capital, right? And to basically your Pressed Loans small and medium businesses and MSME customers, and basically this will provide these kind of loans to Pressed Loans customers in the tier 3 and tier 4 cities. So that's the tie-up between Pressed Loans and your YouGrow Capital, right? So these are some of the tie-ups that have happened. So the idea was that since the answer was Innovity and PhonePe, let's try and bring in some more options which basically can help me discuss more things with you guys from the perspective of different partnerships that have been there in this space, right? So that's where we end this particular session in terms of analysis. Some of these questions obviously require some bit of common sense to answer them. Some bit of questions can be solved through elimination, but most of these questions obviously require some amount of reading for you to be able to answer them effectively, right? So that's the context overall. Right, so that brings us to the end of this particular session, and this was a very different session from the ones that I've done in the past, because this basically took one question, dissected it completely, went much into detail in terms of giving you a lot of valuable information pertaining to that news item, and of course all the allied questions that could be formed from there, right? जब आप options देखते हो, उन options के बारे में जानने की curiosity आती है, and the more you have that curiosity, you can always spend that time to understand those options as well, right? Obviously, those options will have to be developed by someone who understands the subject overall, because that's where you will get the maximum learning, right? And again, this can be a good way of building your vocabulary as well, wherein multiple options, and उन options में जो words हैं वहाँ से आप कितने words develop कर सकते हो, that's a way of learning vocabulary as well. But coming to GA, this can be a good way of understanding the different news that can emanate from a single news point, right? So कितने branches बन सकते हैं? So essentially एक question, उसका एक correct answer, and उसमें चार जो options हैं, those options are additionally giving you, apart from the correct answer, the चार options हैं, those options are additionally giving you multiple avenues to gather new information, right? So that's an interesting approach that you can probably tie out and ensure that this can be used to effectively hone your skills as far as general awareness, banking awareness, and financial awareness is concerned. So very different session in its own right. So I hope you liked it as much as I enjoyed taking it for you guys. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. But one thing which I want to always highlight is that the most important aspect of being great, or let's say being able to achieve what you truly deserve or truly are meant to achieve, is that self-belief, right? You need to have that self-belief despite whatever is happening around you, whatever others have to say to you. All that doesn't really matter. Just remember this saying: it's only one bright star that can illuminate a universe of darkness, right? Just one bright star is enough to dispel the entire darkness of the universe, which means that even if it's entirely dark around you, if you are having that self-belief, then you can be that bright star who can come out successfully, right? So always have that self-belief that you can actually achieve great things, and if you have that belief, you can always do brilliant things in your life. So on that note, this is Ravi signing off. Have a great day and a wonderful week ahead. Keep preparing hard, keep working hard, and you will achieve the success. Self-belief is the key. See you guys.